Chapter 737. Gongjia Ren's eyelids twitched as he stared at the beast that was much taller than him. He felt a chill run down his spine and into his brain. A large crater had appeared in the sand that had exploded in front of him. The flying sand blurred his vision, and sand fell from all directions like a torrential rain. The beast had appeared too quickly for him to dodge. All he could do was crouch down, not daring to move. He hoped the beast would focus on the sand lizards. As soon as it shifted its gaze away, he would immediately burrow into the sand and play dead. Although he did not know if playing dead would work against a beast like this, he had no other choice. He did not have the energy to run, let alone escape. The sand lizards were flipped over by the giant worm. All 5 sand lizards ran for their lives as if they had seen their natural predator. The few of them were no match for the worm. The rest were no better off than Gongjia Ren. Earlier, they thought Gongjia Ren's domineering aura had scared the 5 sand lizards away. They did not expect an even more powerful one to jump out of nowhere. Their faces paled even further as they tried to control their breathing, afraid that they would attract the giant worm's attention. They dared not wipe away the sand that flew into their eyes. They could only blink hard and crouch down to reduce their presence. Their eyes were focused on the movements of the giant worm, thinking about what to do next. There were 5 sand lizards just now. Even if each of them faced one, the one with more wouldn't have a chance to escape because the sand lizards had enough time to finish off the others and chase after the remaining one. Now, a big worm had scared the sand lizards away. Although it looked very powerful, there were 6 of them. Would there be a chance for some of them to escape? Even if they could escape, would they have the energy to do so? They looked at each other, understanding each other's intentions. When the giant worm suddenly chased after one of the sand lizards, they immediately crouched down and dug a hole in the sand to bury themselves. This method was effective against some beasts in the desert, but it was completely useless against others. They didn't know if the big bug would discover them, but they could only do this. They didn't have the strength to run. If the cover of the sand didn't work, they could only accept their fate and wait for death. They could hear booming sounds coming from the sand, as if wooden stakes were smashing down. An invisible pressure filled the surroundings, and the originally difficult breathing became even more careful. After the whooshing sound of something breaking through the air, another boom sounded on the sandy ground. The strong wind blew a large amount of sand, and the feeling of it falling on one's body was like dense rain. They didn't dare to look up. They could only rely on their hearing to determine what was happening outside the sand. The big bug was hunting the sand lizards. Just now, it sounded 4 times in different directions. Did it mean that the 4-legged sand lizards had been killed? With the sudden collapse, he could even feel the sand covering his body becoming heavier and heavier, making it harder for him to breathe. The sand was still shaking. Although it was far from them, this distance was not enough to get them out of danger. Every time they took a careful breath in the sand, they felt as if their throats and lungs were being ground by the sand. It was extremely uncomfortable. The scorching sand on their backs felt as if it was going to cook their entire backs. They did not dare to use their strength to resist, so they could only endure it. Just as they were counting the sounds and anticipating that the big bug would chase after the sand lizards, they suddenly realized that not only was the sound not moving further away, it was actually getting closer. Now, their slightly relieved hearts were in their throats again. Especially Gongjia Ren. He could tell that the sound was coming towards him. There were 2 sounds, one in front and one behind. The one in front was probably the sand lizard, and the one behind must be the big bug. Motherfucker, why is the sand lizard coming this way? Gongjia Ren cursed the sand lizard in his heart a few times but could not change its direction. Boom! There was another explosion of sand, stirring up a strong gust of wind with the roar of a desert beast. The sand and dust on the ground flew in all directions like blooming flowers. Gongjia Ren, who was closest to the explosion, was not spared even though he was sprawled on the ground. The wind and sand came crashing towards him like a violent gust of wind. Gongjia Ren felt like someone had punched him in the back. He couldn't help letting out a muffled groan as his body was flung high into the air by the force of the impact. Then, he crashed to the ground. However, the noise was muffled by the giant worm's pursuit of the sand lizard, so no one knew what happened to Gongjia Ren. Gongjia Ren felt his stomach churn. He almost vomited out the little bit of blood and meat he had eaten earlier. His body, which had not recovered, was now in a worse state. It was difficult for him to even stand now. He wanted to bury himself again as soon as possible, but his arms felt like they were chained to a boulder. It was difficult to even move, Even the sound of bones cracking could be heard. In Gongjia Ren's blurry vision, he saw the blue figure with its two scythe-like forelimbs nailed to the sand lizard's body. The sound of sharp weapons slicing through hard armor and flesh rang clearly in Gongjia Ren's ears. Everything finally came to a stop. The flying sand landed on the sand with a soft thud, then gradually quieted down. The atmosphere was still tense. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It was the sound of sand being kicked up by the big bug as it walked across the sand. The danger had yet to pass. The people in hiding continued to hide, not daring to come out. They did not even dare to lift their heads. However, Gongjia Ren was having a hard time. He saw the big bug walking towards him with a sand lizard nailed to one of its forelimbs. Am I going to die? Gongjia Ren's consciousness began to blur as he watched the big bug approach. However, he was much calmer than before. Perhaps he knew he could not escape, so he gave up on the idea of escaping and waited for death to come. Many thoughts flashed through his mind. Then he closed his eyes. The people hiding in the sand listened to the sounds outside the sand. After some strange noises, they finally left. When everything returned to normal, they carefully lifted their heads and shook off the sand on their bodies. It's finally gone. I almost suffocated to death. It's so hot. I'm so hungry. Are they all here? Are they all still alive? Where's Duran? Duran, where are you? They shouted a few times but did not get any response. Panicking, they ran towards where Gongjia Ren was and dug in the sand for a long time. All they found was Gongjia Ren's simple stone hammer. He was nowhere to be seen. It wasn't just Gongjia Ren. The 5 sand lizards were nowhere to be seen. There were only some bloodstains and scales. Could it be that the big bug took the desert beasts and ran away? Chapter 738. Xiao Xian and the rest followed the insect as it ran through the desert. The insect had great endurance and would only rest at night. When it was hungry, it would scrape the waxy food inside the oval ball. Xiao Xian would also feed it some water. It was such a small insect, it wouldn't consume much water anyway. While following the flying insect, Xiao Xian also sensed Sapphire's presence. At first, he planned to look for the person first. Now, finding the person was the most important thing. Once he found the person, he would look for Sapphire. After all, he had a connection with Sapphire. As his first slave, Sapphire's bond with Xiao Xian was even stronger. Now that Sapphire was awake and not in danger, Xiao Xian did not pay special attention to it. If Sapphire sensed him, it would come looking for him on its own. For example, Xiao Xian could sense Sapphire heading in his direction. Coincidentally, Sapphire was in the direction they were heading. If they kept walking in that direction, they would meet it. They found a rocky spot to rest, replenish their water and adjust their condition before continuing their search. We didn't see any of those legendary monsters. Tua scanned their surroundings. The heat from the sand was distorting the air. Tua didn't sense anyone else's aura, and there were no dangerous beasts either. He opened the water bottle and drank some water. He felt something under his feet and used his feet to push the sand on the surface of the ground to the side, revealing a white skeleton below. They had seen this many times. Along the way, they would occasionally stumble and find bones under the sand. Some belonged to humans, some belonged to beasts. It shouldn't have been long, or there wouldn't even be bones left in this desert. From the wounds on the bones, the fatal injury was caused by a sharp weapon, not a beast's claws or teeth. It looked more like a human's weapon. Other than the monsters from Rock Hill City, there are also desert bandits in the desert. Everyone, be careful, said Xiao Xian. Ah Xian, do you think that person from the Gongjia family is still alive? Asked Lei. The conditions in the desert were harsh. Other than the climate, there was also the threat of perspiration. The Gongjia family only had 10 people. Could they really survive until they found them? It's certain that he's still alive. If he was eaten by a sand beast or killed, he wouldn't even have a complete corpse in this place. In that case, the flying insects will stop. Xiao Xian had read about this in Heng's scroll. Heng had said that if the insects stopped and lingered around for a long time, they would not need to continue searching. This only meant that those people were not lucky enough to last until they were found. So that's how it is. That means the person we're looking for is still alive. That's great. Lei smiled. He did not want to come to the desert and not see any skilled people, only some incomplete bones. As they were talking, they noticed that Xiao Xian was staring in one direction. Tuo asked Xian, "What did you find?" Xiao Xian shook his head. "I just sensed Sapphire's movement. It's coming this way. We should be able to see it soon." "Sapphire? It's here." Tuo, Lei and the rest looked around. They still remembered Xiao Xian's beetle. When he first started, it was small and could be squashed to death with one finger. When Xiao Xian brought Zhang Luo and the rest here, Sapphire appeared again and was already taller than them. "It's been so long, I wonder if it's grown," said Lei. "It must have grown a little." Based on past patterns, Sapphire's body would grow bigger every time it was unlocked. Now that the fourth lock had been unlocked, it must be bigger than the third lock. Xiao Xian thought. A few of them had never seen Sapphire before. They had only heard about it from others, but now that they thought about it, they could not remember. The only thing they remembered was that the insect could cause an insect swarm. It was said that an insect swarm was one of the scariest things in the desert. It was no worse than a sandstorm. Now that they thought about it, they were looking forward to seeing an insect swarm. After resting, he continued on his journey. On the afternoon of the second day, Xiao Xian suddenly stopped walking and looked ahead. Ta and the rest covered Yang Guang with their hands and looked in that direction. Something was approaching. Not a human, but a beast. Ta wanted to warn everyone, but Xiao Xian waved his hand. "It's Sapphire." "Sapphire?" Tuo looked ahead. After a while, he saw a large ball appear on the sand dune. Yes, a large ball. It looked like it was made of sand and there seemed to be something on it. After crossing the sand ridge, the ball rolled down the slope of the sand dune. "Dodge!" Ta and the others cleared a path for the ball to roll past them. The 10-meter-tall ball rolled across the sand, creating a gust of wind. They could clearly feel its size and weight. However, everyone's line of sight didn't stay on the sandball for long. Soon, they noticed that behind the sandball, there was a blue figure that was rapidly approaching. Ray's jaw almost dropped. He pointed at the approaching big bug. "Blue. That's the bug." "That's it." Xiao Xian nodded. "You call that a little?" Ray looked at the beetle that was already 10 steps away. It was much taller than his house. How did it grow so big? What did it eat to become like this? The last time the beetle was lying on the ground, it was only a little taller than a person. Now it was twice as tall. The Yanjiao warrior who saw Sapphire for the first time looked at it in shock. He turned to ask the person next to him in a low voice, "Didn't you say it was only as tall as a person? The last time I saw it, it wasn't that big." Another person cried out. On the other side, Sapphire was very happy to see Xiao Xian. It circled Xiao Xian a few times. Because the others were standing with Xiao Xian, Sapphire circled them. Even though they knew the bug wasn't a threat to them, some people couldn't help but feel nervous. After all, such a big guy was so close to them. It made them feel stressed. After circling a few times, Sapphire hurriedly chased after the sandball that had rolled far away. It stood upside down and rolled the ball back to Xiao Xian with its hind legs. As a slave, this was its greeting gift to its master. It had collected a lot of food and rolled it all together. Collecting things, rolling them into balls and playing with them, was its hobby. After rolling the sandball in front of Xiao Xian, Sapphire stood at the side and waited. It looked like a slave waiting for its master's evaluation. It looked nervous. At this time, everyone could see clearly what was on the sandball. Although the sandball was mainly made up of sand, there were also beast claws and scales that were exposed on the outside. "There's a sand beast in it?" Ray curiously leaned over. "How did this ball come out?" "The sand is so strong that it didn't fall apart." Xiao Xian didn't answer. He saw the bug hovering above the sandball and had a bad feeling. Xiao Xian's expression froze when he saw the skeletons in the ball. A bright flash of a sword flashed and the sandball was cut open. A person rolled out of the hole. "Ha ha, who's this?" "Poor thing." Sapphire wrapped him in a ball. Ray and the rest laughed. Who was this? Someone from Rock Hill City? A desert robber? The latter was more likely. After all, there weren't many normal people in Rock Hill City. As for desert robbers, they weren't good people anyway. Their lives didn't matter to them. But soon, they saw the bug circle in the air and land on the person who had rolled out of the sand dune. His hair was messy and his face was dirty. They couldn't see his face at all. Xiao Xian. The others. They couldn't laugh anymore. Holy shit. No way. This bug was used to find a target. For the sake of accuracy, Gong Jiaheng had ordered the bug to only search for a single target. There would be no mistakes. Now, the flying insect that was used to find the target had stopped on a person who looked like he had stopped breathing. Everyone rushed over to him. Ta personally checked whether the person who had been left motionless was still breathing. If he was dead, their trip would be in vain. After checking, Ta slowly exhaled. His breathing is weak, but he's still alive. His condition isn't good. Let him drink it first. Xiao Xian had already melted a pill in a flask and passed it to Ta. This person is the Gongjia guy we're looking for? Tua looked at the person on the ground and asked Xiao Xian. From the looks of the bug, it's him. Xiao Xian looked at Gongjia Ren on the ground. His injuries are quite serious. I wonder what else he encountered before meeting Sapphire. At this, Xiao Xian looked at Sapphire, who was standing at the side. Sapphire probably realized it had made a mistake and ruffled the sand anxiously. It had wanted to please its master, but in the end, it had almost killed his master's target. It had grabbed the Gongjia ligament with its claws when it was wrapping the lizard. If its target was a human, it would not have let the others hiding in the sand go. I fed him the medicine. As for what happens next, we'll have to wait and see. Ta stood up. Since the key person had been found, they were not in a hurry to continue. Instead, they found a place to rest. It was almost sunset and they had to settle the injured Gongjia Ren down. They found a suitable spot and set up a tent. The tent's frame was made of new bronze. Every frame could be used as a weapon. When it was time to use it, they would assemble it and cover it with cloth. It was a temporary tent. 50 people were squeezed together in the tent, but if there was no sandstorm, they would also rest outside. Now, this tent would be used to settle the injured Gongjia Ren down. It was rare to find him. They could not let him die just like that. Fortunately, although his injuries were serious, Gongjia Ren's condition stabilized quickly after the medicine was fed. His life was no longer in danger and his weak pulse had become stronger. Chapter 739. It was the middle of the night when Gongjia Ren woke up. He thought he would become the desert beast's dung, but he was still alive. Gongjia Ren was still in a daze when he first woke up. It took him a while to realize that he was not dreaming, nor was he in another unknown world after death. He was still alive. He clearly remembered that before he lost consciousness, the giant bug had already walked up to him and raised its claw. But why was he still alive? Why was he not killed by the bug's claw? Plus, there were people breathing in this place. Was he saved? His surroundings were dark, but he could hear the rustling of cloth in the wind. He was inside a cloth shed. The smell of sand wafted from the ground. He was very familiar with this smell after fleeing in the desert for so long. He was still in the desert. There were 4 people breathing around him, slow and regular. They must be asleep. Gongjia Ren sat up carefully. The pain of his broken bones almost made him groan, but he suppressed it. He dared not make a sound before he understood the situation. Someone had fed him medicine and treated his external injuries. Gongjia Ren could clearly feel that his body was much better now. Although the pain was still there, it was much better than when he was running for his life in the desert. He carefully flipped himself up and shuffled his feet on the sand. His surroundings were dark, but there was light in one spot. It was the tent of the cloth shed. The wind outside flapped the tent, and through the flickering gaps, he could see the light outside. It was the light of the moon at night. Gongjia Ren moved over and lifted the tent to look outside. Although the moon was not yet full, it was enough for him to see the situation nearby. Gongjia Ren wanted to see how many people were outside and who they were so he could understand the current situation. However, he froze the moment he lifted the tent slightly. Outside, not far from the tent's door, a giant beetle twice as tall as a human was waiting quietly. Its head was facing the tent. When Gongjia Ren lifted the tent to look outside, the giant beetle looked up too. Gongjia Ren was speechless. He suddenly did not understand the situation. There were people around, but there was a giant beetle lying at the door. Gongjia Ren stared at the giant beetle's bluish carapace under the moonlight. He knew it was the same beetle he saw before he lost consciousness. The scene of the beetle slaughtering the sand lizards was still fresh in his mind. Just as Gongjia Ren did not know how to react, a voice came from behind him. "You just survived. Where do you think you're going?" Gongjia Ren was startled. He put down the tent and turned towards the voice. The tent lit up. Xiao Xian took the water moonstone out of his animal skin bag. With the light, Gong Jiaren could see clearly what was going on inside. Other than the young man who spoke, there were 3 other people. However, all 3 of them were awake, lying on the ground and looking at him. "You saved me?" asked Gong Jiaren. Gong Jiaren of Gong Jiaren. "Thank you," said Gong Jiaren, but he was still wary of Xian and the rest. He was saved by these people, but he did not know their motives. The giant beetle outside was obviously in cahoots with them. He could not help but think. He spoke the language of the other side of the sea, but these people spoke the same language. Only people from the other side of the sea could speak this language. Either they were from the other side of the sea, or they were from various factions in the desert. Either way, he did not want to see them. Xian saw that Gong Jiaren had not let down his guard, so he did not rush to explain. Instead, he took out the small oval ball and twisted it open. Gong Jiaren was surprised when he saw the oval ball. Of course he knew what it was because it was his. When he saw the flying insect, Gong Jiaren turned to Xian. "Who the hell are you?" "Yan Jiao." Xian tossed Heng's scroll to Gong Jiaren. "See for yourself." "Yan Jiao." Heng's suggestion was for Gong Jiaren and the rest to look for Yan Jiao. He even said he would write a letter to the Yan Jiao tribe for assistance. Who would have thought that they would actually come? After reading the scroll, Gong Jiaren finally let down his guard. This was Heng's handwriting and the Gongjia family's cloud code. It could not be faked. "You're Xian?" Gong Jiaren looked at the person who tossed the scroll to him. "That's me." "You're Gong Jiaren? Where are your other companions?" Xian took the scroll from Gong Jiaren and rolled it up. Speaking of which, Gong Jiaren looked out the door and briefly recounted his encounter. Although he had guessed that Sapphire was the cause of this accident, Xian couldn't help but think to himself, "Thank goodness Sapphire has been asleep for too long and hasn't had the time to summon its little brothers. Otherwise, Gong Jiaren and the rest would all be dead." Xian thought that the Gongjia family was similar to Hung, but after listening to Gong Jiaren's description, he realized that not every Gongjia family member had the skills to survive in the wilderness. Most of the Gongjia family members had been learning blacksmithing since they were young under specific mentors. They would probably continue this way until they grew up, taking in apprentices and continuing to blacksmith. Many people would not look for Gongjia Mountain because they did not dare to take that step. Once they left, they did not know when they would return. Some might never return. Gong Jiaren was taken in as an apprentice by a rather famous blacksmith when he was young. He had planned to look for Gongjia Mountain and ask his master about it, but he couldn't find anyone, so he went to look for Hang instead. When his master found out, he was scolded and took back some of the materials he had given him. However, Gong Jiaren did not give up. He continued to ask Heng about Gongjia Mountain. Just as he was about to head to Gongjia Mountain, there was a coup in the royal city. Gong Jiaren's master stood on the wrong side and was killed. Even Gong Jiaren's fellow apprentices did not manage to escape. It was Gong Jiaheng's plea that the new king changed the death sentence to exile. Some of his fellow disciples chose to join other factions while others left on their own. Gong Jiaren had no idea where they went. Gong Jiaren himself went to ask Gong Jiaheng, who was sending them off, where was the best place to go. Unlike Gong Jiaren and the rest, Gong Jiaheng had been to many places and had a broader perspective. Gong Jiaren trusted his advice, so they followed his advice. After being exiled, they followed the planned route to cross the sea. However, they did not expect to be ambushed. There were casualties in the group, and when they finally crossed the sea, they realized that the desert was even more dangerous. They did not have the experience to survive in such a dangerous place. To the Yanjiao people, Gong Jiaren and the rest were a bunch of useless people. However, they had their own specializations. Perhaps all their strengths were in blacksmithing, and they lacked experience in other areas. They didn't even know where to start killing beasts in the fastest and most effective way. Gong Jiaheng was an exception. All his survival experience and beast fighting skills were forced out of him in the forest. The difference was that Hang could use various materials in the forest to create traps to catch beasts. In the desert there were too few materials that could be used. Sometimes, there wasn't even a rock to be found. Knowing that Gong Jiaren still had 5 companions, Xian and the rest planned to look for them too. They were all talents of the Gongjia family. Since they were here, they might as well take them with them. Xian noticed that Gong Jiaren was panting after speaking, so he said, "Your injuries are too serious. Rest first. We'll depart tomorrow." Chapter 740. Gong Jiaren panicked. He was now sprawled on the back of the giant beetle that almost killed him. Due to his severe injuries, he would not be able to recover so quickly even after taking medicine. Even if he could run, he would not be able to keep up. If they wanted to hurry, he would either have to be carried or lie on the beetle's back. Before Gongjia Ren could decide, Xiao Xian picked him up and threw him onto the beetle's back. They had planned to depart the next morning, but Xiao Xian's not divination revealed that daytime was not a good time. There would be sandstorms on their way, so they rested during the day and set off at night. In fact, they preferred to travel at night. The temperature was low at night, and they could catch some sand beasts as food. Previously, they had traveled during the day because the tracking bug was only active during the day. If they wanted to follow the bug, they could only travel during the day. Now that they had found Gongjia Ren, they did not need to rely on the beetle anymore. Gongjia Ren could not remember the route, but Sapphire could. Xiao Xian and the rest only needed to follow the giant beetle. If they were tired, they could lie on the beetle's back to rest. Once they were well rested, they could run again. Needless to say, having a giant beetle like this saved them a lot of energy. Sapphire had already eaten the sand lizards in the ball. It wanted to give them to Xiao Xian, but Xiao Xian threw them to it instead. Sapphire did not need much water. It was used to the desert environment and did not lack water easily like humans. Gongjia Ren now agreed with Heng's suggestion. The Yanjiao people did not look weak. Years ago, he had heard that the Yanjiao people had sent the head of the Lu family flying with a single slap in the royal city. He had never seen it with his own eyes, only heard about the Yanjiao people. That was why he agreed when Heng suggested to look for the Yanjiao people. After all, having a strong backer would increase their chances of survival. Now he could feel the benefits. At night, the beetle's carapace was as cold as metal. Gongjia Ren was still weak from his injuries, so he asked Xiao Xian for a piece of animal skin to cushion himself. He wondered how his 5 companions were doing after he left. The giant beetle only took away the 5 sand lizards that appeared later. The sand lizard that they killed together was still there. It should be enough for the 5 of them to eat and not starve to death. However, when they arrived at the place where Gongjia Ren was taken away, the 5 men were nowhere to be seen. Left? Tuo asked. After all, 2 days had already passed, and those people wouldn't stay in the same place for so long. No, they should be nearby. They couldn't drag the sand lizard away, but they wouldn't waste a rare prey like this. They would find a place to hide and eat the sand beast to recover their strength before continuing their journey, said Gongjia Ren. This was his conjecture based on the temperament of the 5 people. But there's no one around, Xiao Xian said. Hearing this, Gongjia Ren frowned. He was worried that the 5 men might have met with some other trouble after he left. Xiao Xian looked around, then walked towards a spot. He used the knife in his hand to brush away the sand on the ground. Gongjia Ren's gaze lingered on the knife in Xiao Xian's hand for a few seconds. He had seen Xiao Xian's knife when he first woke up. Although the workmanship was rough, he had to admit that it was a good knife. However, he had never seen the material. If he wasn't in a hurry to find his companions, he would definitely ask more about the knife. Even now, his gaze lingered on the knife for a few more seconds. Shifting his gaze away from the knife, Gongjia Ren looked at the sand. There was a skeleton. It was the sand lizard they killed together. It's still here. Gongjia Ren was even more worried. If there were no accidents, those people would not have given up on the sand lizard. In other words, the 5 of them had encountered something else and failed to hide the sand lizard. The sand lizard had been gnawed by other desert animals until only its skeleton was left. The movement of sand in the desert was easy to cover their tracks. Moreover, 2 days had passed. Even the crater created by Sapphire's slaughter of the sand lizard had been filled up. They could not find any more traces to follow. What do we do? Ta looked at Xiao Xian. We can only use the old method. Get Sapphire to look for them. Insects had a stronger sense of smell than humans. Insects could smell things that humans could not. Although Sapphire was not as good as flying insects that specialized in tracking, it was better than nothing. Gongjia Ren was about to say something when he felt a tremor. Sapphire was smashing the ground with its forelimbs. Thud, thud, thud. It was not the kind of unbridled murderous smashing that was full of killing intent when hunting sand lizards. Instead, it was more like sending out a kind of signal with a regular pattern. When smashing down, it controlled the angle and did not raise a large amount of sand and dust. What is it doing? Gongjia Ren was puzzled. Did beetles use this method to find people? He had never heard of this before. It's just happy, said Xueqi as he looked at Sapphire's hind legs kicking the sand. When Sapphire was happy, it would kick its hind legs like kicking a ball. Xueqi knew this very well. Happy? What is it happy about? It was not just Gongjia Ren. The others did not understand either. Xueqi did not explain further. Instead, he pointed downwards. Look at the ground. The ground? What was on the ground? Everyone looked downwards. Other than sand there was still sand. Something's not right, Ta exclaimed suddenly. An inexplicable sense of danger rose in him, as if a chill had brushed past his back. Goosebumps broke out all over Ta's body. People with rich hunting experience and strong intuition all had the same feeling. Their surroundings were silent. Other than the soft sound of the wind rustling the sand, there were no other sounds. It was as if all living creatures had left. Lying on the beetle's back, Gongjia Ren shuddered inexplicably. Although the scorching sun was scorching the beetle's back, he could still feel a chill seeping out of his bones. In terms of intuition, he was not as good as the Yanjiao, but after surviving in the desert for so many days, he could more or less react. They stared unblinkingly at the sand, waiting to see what was underneath. Rustle, rustle, rustle. There were some soft sounds. Every movement was not loud, but there were many places, as if something was rushing out from underground. Rustle, rustle, rustle. It was getting closer. A dot of black emerged from the yellow sand. Then, 2 dots of black, 3 dots, 4 dots, 10 dots, 100 dots, 1,000 dots. The densely packed black dots covered the original yellow sand. Gongjia Ren took a deep breath, his voice trembling as he looked at the scene before him. This is an insect swarm. This was one of the legendary desert disasters, the insect swarm. More and more black beetles emerged, and it was not stopping. Not a speck of yellow sand could be seen nearby. In the distance, the sand was gradually being eroded by the black. More and more beetles gathered around the giant beetle. Gongjia Ren, who was lying on Sapphire's back, felt the most keenly. He did not even have the strength to sit up, beads of sweat dripping from his forehead. Most of the Yanjiao people had encountered similar situations before. Back when they came to the desert to fetch people from the coast, they had encountered insect swarm as well. That was why they knew that as long as Sapphire was around, the insect swarm would not be a threat to them. The bad feeling was purely a conditioned response to danger. Insect swarms were harder to deal with than fearsome beasts. Plus, they felt that these insects were even more dangerous this time. Gongjia Ren looked around nervously but realized that other than a few people, most of the Yanjiao people were calm. There was no fear or caution in their eyes. Instead, there was interest. Gongjia Ren snapped out of his daze and understood. He was lying on the giant beetle's back. And now, these little beetles that had appeared were in cahoots with this big beetle. They might even be obeying this big beetle. So it was a false alarm. Gongjia Ren let out a long sigh of relief. However, halfway through his exhalation, he suddenly remembered that his companions wouldn't have been eaten by the insect swarm, would they? Not long after emerging, the little beetles burrowed back into the sand. They did not like to move above the sand during the day, especially when the sun was shining brightly. When all the little beetles had burrowed back into the sand, Gongjia Ren asked, "Could my companions have encountered an insect swarm here?" "No," said Xueqi confidently. Indeed, if Gongjia Ren's companions had encountered an insect swarm, with their current abilities, there was no way they could escape. They would only be eaten. However, there were no human skeletons here. Even if the beetles had eaten all the bones, why was the sand lizard skeleton still there? Hence, the only explanation was that the 5 of them did not encounter an insect swarm. Since they did not encounter an insect swarm, they must have left for some other reason. Xueqi instructed Sapphire to track them down. It could find people based on their scent. Hence, the giant blue beetle circled the sand a few times before heading in a certain direction. "Follow it." Xueqi gestured for the rest to follow. After chasing for a while, Xueqi took out his universal eye. "That direction is not towards Rock Hill City. If we go that way, we'll probably encounter desert bandits." They won't be heading towards the desert bandits. Unless they have no choice. Gongjia Ren's heart sank. This was not good news. Could they have joined the desert bandits? It was not impossible to find support in a desperate situation. Just like when they first entered the desert, some of their team members had done so. However, Gongjia Ren believed that the 5 of them were forced to do so. They were taken away by the desert bandits, not joining the desert bandits. No matter what the truth was, they would find the answer if they continued searching. Initially, Gongjia Ren was worried that the Yanjiao people would choose not to join the desert bandits because they did not want to provoke them. However, halfway through, he heard the Yanjiao people talking about robbing the desert bandits and swallowed his words. When he thought about the giant beetle beneath him, then about the insect swarm that might be following them under the sand, Gongjia Ren was suddenly not afraid. Chapter 741. There are many bandit groups in the desert, big and small, scattered around the desert borders. They didn't dare to get too close to the center of the desert as they were afraid of the people from Rock Hill City and the legendary undying monsters. Xiao and the rest followed Sapphire in a certain direction. They had already walked so far and they were heading towards the area with the most bandit groups. They were sure that the 5 of them went to the bandit group, but they didn't know if they were forced or not. In that direction there were indeed desert bandits. However, if they continued to walk in that direction, they would leave the desert and see lakes, forests, and tall mountains. However, none of the desert bandits went there because there were many ferocious beasts that they couldn't fight against. The beasts in the desert would often go there to drink water. During the breeding season, the fighting was even more intense. Only the strong in the food chain could survive there. The bandits didn't have the ability to go there yet. Xiao knew about the situation there because past the mountain range, they were very close to the grasslands and the Hui tribe. The reason why the Hui tribe was able to capture a monster and bring it back was because they were closer to the desert. However, if it weren't for special circumstances, they wouldn't go through the mountain range. Although it's a short journey, it's troublesome. In the past, they would take the longer route to the desert and it would take a longer time, but it was safer. While he was deep in thought, Xiao recalled the general situation. The desert bandits were forced to the border and had nowhere else to go. If they retreated further, they would have to fight with the beasts. However, any force that could survive Rock Hill City's purge was not to be underestimated. Although many people said that the bandits were mostly built by the slave masters, compared to Wu Yan, the group formed by the slaves was more dangerous. The leaders of the slaves who could truly establish a powerful organization and survive the chaos of the desert were likely to be those who had already broken free from their shackles. To be able to break free from the slave masters' enslavement and break free from their shackles, every one of them was extremely talented and had a strong temperament. They were even more terrifying than the slave masters. Xiao even dared to say that in a few decades, the scattered forces in the desert would disappear or be gathered together. Among the last remaining forces, the slaves would definitely establish more forces than the slave masters. However, in the current situation, whether it's the slaves or the slave masters, they aren't easy to talk to. At this time, at the edge of the desert, there was a small city made of sand and stones. It was not a big city. Compared to the several big cities in the desert, it was not even 1/10 the size. At most, it could only be regarded as a place to gather and shelter people from the wind and rain. The people in this town have dark brown patterns on their bodies like snakes coiling around their bodies. They are known as the Psan snakes. The Psan snakes are one of the more famous bandit groups. The leader of this group is a man named He Sha. He used to be a slave, but during the chaos of the desert, he escaped with a group of slaves and broke free from his shackles. He then built the Psan snakes at the edge of the desert. Outside the small town, a group of nearly 100 people approached. They were stopped at the gate of the small town. The group left their camels outside and left a few people to take care of the camels. The leader led the others into the small town. These people didn't belong to this town or the Psan snakes. They belonged to another bandit group, the Blue Beetle. The Blue Beetle is one of the more unique groups among the bandit groups. They were also one of the earliest groups to be established. When many people were fleeing, they found a place with a well. When everyone else was using rocks as weapons, they were already using gold. Rumors say that the Blue Beetle has a slave master supporting them. However, after a few years, those who know the Blue Beetle know that there is no slave master in the group. The leader is also a slave named Yiken who broke free from his shackles. Probably because they rose too early, they gained the upper hand. By the time the bandit group started to develop, the Blue Beetle had already gained a firm foothold and recruited many people. Now, the Blue Beetle is one of the more famous bandit groups. They're not any weaker than the Psan snakes. However, compared to other groups, the Blue Beetle name wasn't as domineering. Other groups had names with words like snake, scorpion, vulture, knife, axe, and so on. The blue beetle, on the other hand, took on an insect name. Even their symbol looked ridiculous. They were no longer tribesmen. However, if they wanted to rebuild their tribe, a symbol full of meaning was necessary. A symbol signified faith. It was a spiritual sustenance in a difficult situation. It also signified the beginning of a new life, similar to the tribesman's totem. Therefore, they tried their best to use powerful species as symbols for their groups. For example, the sand snake symbol was a desert viper. A tiny drop of its venom was enough to kill people. It was feared. As for the blue beetle, their symbol was a blue bug. The blue beetle was probably the only bandit group that used a bug as a symbol. Although many mocked them in private, they didn't understand why they would use such a symbol. The blue beetle leader must be out of his mind to come up with such a symbol. However, in front of the blue beetle members, no one dared to mock them. Otherwise, a bloody battle would ensue. Among these people, other than the leader, the others had yet to break free from their shackles. After all, not everyone could reach that step. After all, there were only a few people who had the talent, strength, and temperament. Now, these people had already established their own forces. After being slaves for so long, once they saw a glimmer of hope, they would have thoughts of rebellion. They no longer wanted to be slaves. They no longer wanted to be ordered around and trampled on by others. They wanted to control their own futures. This time, the blue beetle leader, Xueqi, was at the forefront. He was here to negotiate with Black Sand. Xueqi was very tanned. Most of the slaves in the desert were like that. He didn't look very strong and his body was lean. Standing opposite him was the sand snake's leader, Black Sand. His body was covered in firm muscles. Under his tanned skin, he looked like an iron tower. His naked upper body was surrounded by black vipers. His entire being exuded a dangerous and oppressive aura. Long time no see, Xueqi. Black Sand strode over. Although there was a smile on his face, his eyes were gloomy. He didn't look like he was in a good mood. Xueqi, on the other hand, acted as if he didn't see his expression. He maintained his pace and his tone was calm and distant. Long time no see, Black Sand. Both of them raised their palms and clapped in the air. Their eyes met, filled with wariness. Black Sand's gaze swept across Xueqi. On Xueqi's exposed arms was an inverted beetle. Above the beetle was a round ball. Chapter 742. This time, the blue beetles were here mainly for an important resource. A few days ago, the blue beetles and the vipers had their eyes on a place. That place was the stronghold of another desert bandit group. There was a hidden underground spring there. Although they could not see anything from the surface, they received news that there was an underground palace built by a slave master in secret. Many slave masters like to build underground palaces. However, there were not many suitable places in the desert to build underground palaces, so there were very few underground palaces. After the slave master built the underground palace, he discovered that there was water seeping through somewhere in the palace. Finally, he discovered that there was an underground spring there. Although the underground spring was not big, it was a precious resource in a place like this where there was a shortage of water. After all, not every underground palace could encounter such a thing. It was no doubt a pleasant surprise to encounter such a thing. However, the slave master did not spread the news. Instead, he executed all the slaves who discovered the spring and kept it a secret for himself. He even sealed the underground palace and treated it as a hidden treasure that belonged to him. Later, due to the changes in the desert, the slave master escaped to the underground palace with his people. He planned to use it as a temporary stronghold to develop his power. However, his slaves betrayed him. One of them broke through his shackles and escaped his control. The slave master was killed and the underground palace was seized by the slave who broke through his shackles. He gathered some of the escaped slaves and eventually developed into a desert bandit group, Xueqi. Xueqi was another name for rain in the desert. Therefore, when people heard the name Xueqi, they did not think too much about it. The desert people's desire for rain was well known. No one found it strange that a desert bandit group would choose such a name. However, many people did not know that they actually wanted to use the name Underground Spring, because the spring below the underground palace was their source of life. It was their hope. However, that would be too straightforward. If they said it out loud, people would be able to guess what was below. They were not that stupid. Therefore, they chose the opposite of earth, sky. Xueqi's power also developed quickly. However, the secret was not kept for long. The desert bandits that were gathered were not united. Even if the secret was only known by a few leaders of Xueqi, it was made known to everyone because of an internal conflict. Slowly, other desert bandit groups found out about it through some means. Blue Beetle and Viper were just two of them. There were many more who had their eyes on that place. Not long ago, Black Sand had approached Xueqi with the intention of working together to take down the Sky Water Underground Palace. If they were to go alone, even if they managed to take down the palace, they wouldn't be able to hold it for long. Bloody battles between desert bandit groups were always filled with casualties. It would consume too much energy and it wasn't worth it. After careful consideration, Xueqi decided to give it a try. The place they used to live in was no longer suitable. The spring there was shrinking and would probably disappear in the near future. The Blue Beetle was now growing stronger. As the leader, Xueqi had to think for the future. His ambitions weren't limited to this. Therefore, Xueqi brought his men here to negotiate with Black Sand. The trust level between desert bandit groups wasn't high. If they wanted to work together, they had to first discuss the distribution of resources. If they couldn't come to an agreement, there was no need for cooperation. The two bandit leaders walked into a stone house made of sand and stone. This was the heart of the small town, and it was also the most luxurious house in the town. Most of the houses in other parts of the town were made of sand and stone. Even if they were made of sand and stone, there weren't many stones. However, stones were the main building material here. It looked sturdier and taller than other houses. The only one who could live here was Black Sand, the leader of the desert bandit group. Although it couldn't compare to the slave master's place, Black Sand was still satisfied to have his own mansion. He also believed that he could build an even more luxurious palace in the future, just like the slave masters in the past. Black Sand led Xueqi into the house. The two leaders had a discussion but the others didn't enter. It involved some secrets that they didn't want others to know. With Xueqi as an example, even if they were from the same gang, they couldn't fully trust each other. Therefore, Black Sand suggested that only the two leaders would talk in private while the others waited outside. Xueqi didn't object to this. However, after entering the house, to Xueqi's surprise, Black Sand didn't bring up the topic of cooperation immediately. Instead, he talked about something else. A few days ago, we, the Vipers, added a newcomer, said Black Sand. Xueqi looked at Black Sand, waiting for him to continue. It was common for newcomers to join a desert bandit group. It wasn't unusual, but Black Sand must have brought it up for a reason. He's from that side. Black Sand pointed in a direction. Xueqi understood. It seemed that the newcomer came from the other side of the sea. The desert bandits liked to rob people from the other side of the sea. Firstly, people from other tribes wouldn't step into the desert. Only people from the other side of the sea would come here. Secondly, people from the other side of the sea always brought along many unique items such as gold wares, more exquisite clothing and so on. They liked to rob these people. The newcomer, in order to seek protection, gave me this to show his sincerity. Black Sand pulled out a golden sword from behind the stone chair. There were some words on the sword that they couldn't understand, but that didn't stop them from admiring the patterns. The patterns engraved on the sword looked mysterious, accentuating the preciousness and rarity of the sword. Black Sand turned the hilt and swept his gaze over to Xueqi. Then, he gripped the hilt tightly and slashed downwards. The blade sliced through the air with a sharp whistling sound. Then, it hit a rock beside him. With a crisp sound, the rock that was the size of a human head split into two. Xueqi's pupils contracted and his body tensed up. He knew that Black Sand was showing off and intimidating them at the same time. A good weapon was also a great help. These people who were once slaves and later broke through their shackles were actually not that far off in terms of strength now. Otherwise, they would not have been in a situation where there was a balance of forces instead of directly annexing them. The weapons they usually used couldn't compare to this sword at all. Because of this sword, the two men who were originally evenly matched began to lean towards one side. However, after Black Sand slashed the sword, he returned it to the chair. His goal had been achieved. He believed that the next negotiation would be easier. He didn't plan to attack the Blue Beetle directly. He didn't have absolute confidence in killing Xueqi even if he had this legendary sword. Moreover, in order to take down Sky Water's underground palace, he still needed to cooperate with the Blue Beetle. The purpose of intimidating them earlier was just to gain more benefits during the negotiation. While the leaders of the two major desert robber organizations were secretly discussing their cooperation, in another part of the small town, a place where captives were kept, there were a few people locked up in a low, sandy house. These people were either captured during a battle or robbed. There were several types of captives here. The first type were those who were important and were temporarily locked up here to await the leader's follow-up decision. For example, the 5 captives who were captured yesterday. The other type were those who were useless. These people were locked up here and wouldn't receive any food. At most, they would be given some water mixed with sand to ensure that they wouldn't die immediately. However, these people wouldn't be locked up here for long. They would be brought out soon and become food for the desert robbers. There wasn't much to eat in the desert, so humans became food too. To the slaves, irrelevant people were no different from other beasts. Therefore, they would eat them when they were hungry. There was no psychological pressure, and it was even natural for the desert robbers. One of the vipers who was guarding there was sitting in the shade, avoiding Yang Guang's exposure to the sun. He yawned and glanced around occasionally, listening to the movements of the people in the house. After another yawn, the man felt that something seemed to be moving under his feet. There were often some small beasts in the desert and they were used to the situation. Therefore, the man calmly moved his feet away and took out his dagger, intending to see what was below. It would be good if it was edible. The thing under the sand was getting closer and closer. The man raised the dagger in his hand, waiting for the right time to stab down. However, the thing under the sand seemed to have sensed the danger on the ground. Just as it was about to climb out of the sand, it turned and went in the other direction. Not wanting to give up on the possible food in front of him, the man got up and chased after it. Anyway, there were other people guarding here and it wouldn't be a big deal if he left for a while. After the man left, the sand on the sand bulged and a dozen black beetles the size of a palm drilled out from the ground. Behind them, Xiao Xian pushed the sand aside and drilled out from under the sand. Chapter 743. Sapphire was enslaved by Xiao Xian, so its aura was similar to Xiao Xian's. After all, its power came from Xiao Xian and it was Sapphire's power that attracted the beetles. Others might not be able to tell the difference, but the little beetles could. They would not harm Xiao Xian. In fact, Xiao Xian could even order them to do certain things. These slightly larger beetles had led the swarm of beetles to hunt for food while Sapphire was asleep. Compared to the other beetles, they were not only different in size but also stronger and smarter. However, no matter how smart they were only similar to regular beasts. Even Sapphire could not make them carry out complicated orders. However, simple orders were still possible. For example, luring the guards away or leading the other beetles to dig a hole in the sand. Xiao Xian and the rest had followed Sapphire all the way to this small town because most of the land around the town was flat and there was nowhere to hide. Their goal was to save people, not to fight the desert bandits. Even if they had to fight, they had to save the people first. Hence, they came up with another plan. Sapphire brought Xiao Xian underground. Due to Sapphire's large size, it would easily alert the desert bandits. That was why Sapphire only brought Xiao Xian underground for a short while and left the rest of the task to the other beetles. They had the experience of walking under a quagmire. It was more difficult to walk under sand, but it was not impossible. Plus, they had the help of the beetles underground. There were more beetles underground that had yet to emerge. Sapphire could determine the approximate location of the 5 Gongjia family members. Xiao Xian only came out to sense their exact location. He had a beetle lure a guard away before emerging from the sand. There was a guard on each side of the house. The guard on this side had been lured away. It was no wonder the beetles liked to be underground. During the day, the temperature was much lower under the sand and they did not need to be exposed to the sun. This was a courtyard structure. There were some scattered bones in the corner of the courtyard. Xiao Xian could tell from the shape of the bones that they belonged to humans, both adults and children. The house and courtyard walls were relatively short, so if Xiao Xian walked outside, the people in the courtyard could see half of his head. Similarly, if Xiao Xian stood up straight in the courtyard, he would be seen by the people outside. There were about 10 people sitting outside the courtyard, leaning against the wall. They were all gathered in the shade. Xiao Xian did not fully emerge from the sand, only exposing his upper body. He carefully sensed his surroundings to understand where the guards were and search for his target. The 5 Gongjia family members' auras were different from the other captives. Xiao was certain where they were locked up. Unfortunately, they were not on this side, but it was fine. The beetles that crawled out from the ground gathered again and burrowed into the sand. Xiao Xian took a deep breath and sank into the sand. Not long after Xiao Xian sank, the guard who left returned. He did not manage to catch the thing underground, so he walked over, cursing as he sat down and continued to nap. On the other side, in a mud hut, the 5 Gongjia family members were tied up tightly using the sturdy vines of the desert. These vines may look shriveled and thin, but they were very sturdy. Other than injuries, the 5 of them were thirsty and hungry. They were weak and had no energy to struggle. They laid on the ground, surrounded by mud walls and sand. Their eyes were either open or closed, but they were not asleep. No one knew what they were thinking. That day, they did not manage to find Gongjia Ren. Not long after, they encountered a group of desert bandits, one of whom was their former comrade. Their comrade led the desert bandits to capture them and only gave them some water so they would not die immediately. The Vipers wanted them to forge weapons for the Vipers, but they refused and were locked up here. Yesterday, they had witnessed the desert bandits eating humans. They knew that the desert bandits had done it on purpose for them to see, but they also knew that the desert bandits were real. They had long heard that tribesmen ate humans and that the people here were barbaric. However, seeing it with their own eyes was still a huge shock. Even now, they were still traumatized. If they agreed to forge weapons for the desert bandits, they would be able to live like slaves. Judging by the Vipers' behavior, it did not seem like they would treat them kindly. However, if they did not agree, they would become food for the desert bandits. What should they do? Should they choose to live or die? I really want to kill myself, mumbled the younger man leaning against the wall with his head lowered. That's a good idea, but I can't accept it. Another older man looked up at the leaking roof and sighed helplessly. Yes, they had all thought of suicide, but they still had some hope. Perhaps there would be a turning point? At the end of the day, they just could not accept it. No one would be willing to die in the desert just like that before they could create a masterpiece. If not, how could they have persevered until now? If we didn't choose to come here. One of them smiled bitterly and fell silent. There were no ifs in this world. They had chosen this path, so they had to bear the consequences. Previously, they had thought of digging their way out of the sand, but later they realized that it was too difficult. With their current physical strength, it was impossible to dig their way out of the sand. Not to mention that their hands and feet were tied up. The desert bandits were also aware of their situation, which was why they were at ease tying them up and leaving them here. Rustle, rustle, rustle. There was the sound of tiny grains of sand rubbing against each other. Xueqi, stop playing with sand. It's annoying, complained a man with his eyes closed in the corner. The young man leaning against the wall looked up blankly. I'm not playing with sand. After saying that, he shifted his gaze to the place where the sound came from. He saw that the sand on the ground moved, and a black beetle crawled out. There's a bug, cried Gongjia loudly. The man standing guard outside heard it too, but he did not care. He continued to nap. There were plenty of bugs in the desert. Scorpions and lizards were common too. A small bug was nothing. Inside the house, 10 palm-sized beetles crawled out but did not approach the people inside. Instead, they waited by the side. A hand reached out from the sand. Seeing this scene, the 5 people sucked in a breath of cold air and almost cried out. They looked at the spot where the beetles crawled out and saw a person slowly crawling out from the sand. The 5 of them stared blankly at this strange stranger. When they snapped back to reality, their first thought was, could they be saved? Xiao Xian looked at the 5 people in the house and was satisfied. They were not stupid enough to not scream. One of them asked in a low voice, "Who are you? Are you here to save us?" Xiao Xian did not answer. Instead, he asked, Gongjia Yi, Shi, Rong, Shen Can? These were their names, told to him by Gongjia Ren. At Xiao Xian's words, the 5 people's eyes lit up. They were about to say something when Xiao Xian raised his hand and gestured for them to keep their voices down. The 5 of them nodded quickly, their eyes shining even brighter. Xiao Xian took out a piece of cloth and opened it under the light. There were words written by Gongjia Ren on it. The purpose was to tell the 5 people that Xiao Xian was here to save them, to make them believe in Xiao Xian. With the light from above, the 5 of them could read the words on the cloth clearly. They were so excited they wanted to cry. This person could get out from under the sand. Could he get them out from under the sand too? At this thought, the 5 of them suddenly felt that this person was reliable. They looked forward to Xiao Xian's next move. This was not the time to talk too much. The more they spoke, the higher the chance of them being discovered. That was why they just had to believe in Xiao. With Gongjia Ren's cloth, they did not have to suspect anything. Xiao walked towards the nearest person and cut off his vines. He waved at the others, gesturing for them to come closer. The 5 of them were overjoyed, but soon, they felt that the development of the situation was different from what they had imagined. Wait, I understand the logic, but brother, why did you untie us and tie us up? Yes, after Xiao untied the vines, he connected the vines together to tie them up. Not only that, he used his own rope to reinforce the vines so that none of them would fall off easily. The 5 of them looked at Xiao in confusion, not understanding Xiao's intentions. Xiao wanted to ask the beetles to help transport the 5 of them out. However, the beetles would not eat Xiao, but the same could not be said for the others. Sapphire had been in hibernation for a long time and had just encountered a swarm of beetles. He did not know if it could control these insects accurately. That was why there was no need to take such a risk when there was another way. Xiao did not want the 5 of them to be reduced to skeletons when they were dragged out from under the sand. After tying them up, Xiao gave Sapphire, who was underground outside the small town, an order to execute the next step. 100 meters away from the small town, a gush of sand suddenly shot out. The sand shot up high like a water column, then fell back down. That was a signal. Xiao looked at the sky through the gap in the roof. When he saw the figure high in the sky, he sank back into the sand, leaving the 5 tied-up people in the house looking at each other. Not long after, there was a sudden scream from somewhere outside. It seemed that something had happened there. The guards rushed over. Xiao appeared in the house again. He lifted the 5 tied-up people and cut open the place where they were tied up on the door made of thorny plants. In order to make it easier for the desert bandits to enter and exit the house, the door was wide enough for Xiao to drag the 5 of them out. The guards were attracted by the shouts, and even the guards outside the courtyard turned their attention over there. Therefore, there was no one else at the door of the house. The 5 of them still did not understand what Xiao was trying to do until Xiao lifted them up and threw them into the air like a ball. The ground quickly moved away and the small courtyard where the captives were held shrank in their vision. The 5 of them felt as if their heartbeats had stopped and their minds were blank for a moment. Above them, a figure whizzed past and the 5 tied-up people were carried away into the distance. Chapter 744. The guards who were guarding the captives ran over when they heard a scream. When they saw one of their comrades sunk into the sand from the head down, they rushed over to check on the situation. Who would have thought that something would happen in such a short time? The guards screamed as they rushed to the captives' room. The room where the 5 important figures were locked up was empty. The captives escaped. Someone's snatching the captives. Go after them. They're too fast, we can't catch up. The 5 captives we caught yesterday have been taken away. Quick, inform the chief. Xiao had already sunk into the sand before those people arrived. However, he did not leave. He planned to stay here and observe. After he snuck in, he heard the guards outside talking about the Viper and the Blue Beetle leaders. He wanted to see what these desert bandits were up to. At the same time, he wanted to find out where the person who betrayed Gongjia Ren was. Before Xiao arrived, Gongjia Ren had told Xiao that if he saw the traitor, he should kill him immediately. That way, Gongjia Ren would owe Xiao a favor. As for the sword, Gongjia Ren did not insist. He planned to start anew and believed that he would be able to forge a better sword in the future. As for the previous one, since it was stolen, he did not want to take it back. It was a farewell to the past. The Yanjiao people did not understand Gongjia Ren's feelings. If they lost a good sword, they would definitely think of ways to get it back. There was no such thing as a mood, a new beginning or an old one. However, since Gongjia Ren did not ask for it, Xiao did not pay too much attention to it. On the other hand, after hearing the report, the atmosphere between the 2 chiefs had turned sour. After hearing the news, Black Sand's gloomy face turned ferocious. He glared at Yaiken. You cheated. Black Sand's eyes were suddenly bloodshot, as if they were dyed red. This happened every time he used the power in his body after breaking through the shackles. When he heard the news, Yaiken cursed internally. Now that he saw Black Sand in this state, he knew that this discussion could not continue. We didn't do it. Yaiken distanced himself from Black Sand and tried his best to explain. He was not stupid. It was not a good thing to fall out with the sand snake now. Moreover, he did not know who was being held captive by the Black Sand tribe. It seemed that the Black Sand tribe valued this person. Regardless of anything else, he would not admit to this. Unfortunately, Black Sand refused to listen or believe him. Other than the blue beetles, there was no one else here. Furthermore, he had always been wary of the blue beetles. When he first heard the news, he suspected that Xueqi had already sent people to kidnap those who could forge better weapons. Now, Xueqi was playing dumb in front of him. How preposterous! How dare he trick him? I want you all dead. Black Sand swung his thick arm. A sharpened bone spear flew out from his hand and shot straight at Xueqi. Xueqi, who was prepared for this, swung his sword horizontally in front of him, deflecting the bone spurs that were flying towards him. He roared, "I told you it wasn't us." Meeting Black Sand's bloodshot eyes, Xueqin's heart skipped a beat. This was probably the after-effect of breaking through the shackles. Everyone's symptoms were different. Black Sand's was easily irritable. The most obvious sign of this was his bloodshot eyes. Black Sand was already in a berserk state. He wouldn't listen no matter what was said. Moreover, the relationship between the two parties was not harmonious to begin with. The discussion just now was not a pleasant one, which further provoked Black Sand's anger. Without another word, Xueqi leaped up and rushed out of the room through the animal skin scale that was used as a cover. He let out a wolf-like howl towards the sky. He was telling his subordinates that the negotiation had failed. Everyone be careful. The Blue Beetle desert robbers who were waiting outside gathered around Xueqi. They pulled out their weapons and faced the sand snake people who were surrounding them. Bang! The rare wooden door in the desert was kicked to pieces. Black Sand walked out like a tall tower. Every step he took on the sand creaked loudly, as if he wanted to crush the sand even more. The murderous aura emanating from him swept out in all directions. Even the sand snakes couldn't help but take 2 steps back. How dare you trick me? Black Sand squeezed the words out from between his teeth. The air he exhaled from his nostrils made him sound like an angry bull. I told you we didn't do it, idiot. Use your brain and think. After Xueqi said that, he realized that it was useless to tell Black Sand this. For Black Sand to be able to lead the sand snakes to this point meant that he wasn't a reckless man. Perhaps Black Sand now understood that it wasn't the Blue Beetle who kidnapped those people. He was just venting his anger on the Blue Beetle people. He even wanted to use force to force Xueqi to continue the negotiation that failed to reach an agreement earlier. While the two parties were in a tense standoff, none of them noticed that a figure had sneaked into Black Sand's mansion. The figure sat by the window and watched everything outside. Xiao Xian was very interested in the Blue Beetle desert robber group. The pattern on their bodies was a beetle pushing a dung ball. How did they think of using this as a symbol? Blue beetle? In the desert, most of the beetles were black in color. Even if they were interested in the dung-pushing beetle, they should be called black beetles. Why would they be called blue beetles? Could it be that they've seen sapphires before? Regardless of the truth, the Blue Beetle people weren't in a good situation. Walking out of the house, Black Sand's muscles squirmed and his bones creaked. It wasn't the sound of breaking, but every bone in his body was preparing for the upcoming battle. Wielding his sword, Black Sand took a few large strides towards Xueqi. He raised his arm high and twisted his wrist that was gripping the hilt of his sword. The golden light reflected off the blade bloomed with murderous intent as it slashed towards Xueqi at lightning speed. With the sound of metal clashing, the sword in Xueqi's hand broke. People on the other side of the sea liked to use swords. After the robberies, the desert robbers were now using swords as their weapon of choice. This was especially true for leaders like Xueqi. Most of them used swords. But now the weapon in his hand, which he once thought to be a great weapon, had broken so cleanly. Without looking at the broken sword, Xueqi's body was like a fully drawn bow. His ankle twisted on the sand and his body borrowed the force to take 3 steps back. Each step was more than 2 meters away, avoiding Black Sand's second slash. At the same time, he reached behind him and pulled out a spearhead. This was the weapon he used in his early days. However, the handle of the spear was broken and he had a new weapon. After polishing the spearhead, he carried it with him and used it as a dagger. The elders in the team said that it would bless him to return safely every time. Now, Xueqi wasn't sure if he could return safely. Things had gone beyond his expectations. The sword in his opponent's hand made him wary. Since his second slash didn't hit anyone, Black Sand wasn't in a hurry to continue. He looked at the broken sword on the ground and then at Yiken's ordinary-looking spearhead. He snickered, his crimson eyes filled with mockery and satisfaction. The spinning sword reflected Yang Guang's light at Yiken and the others. Even though it was just a reflection of light, it was enough to make the blue beetles' faces change. They had seen with their own eyes how the sword had broken their leader's weapon. Now that the reflected light shone on them, they felt even more pressured. It was as if the blade of a sword was scraping against their bodies. They were so nervous that their palms were sweating. "I'll give you a choice." Black Sand's words were slow, but they carried an irrefutable authority. His bloodshot eyes stared straight at Yiken and the others. "Over at Heavenly Water, do as I say. And if I refuse?" Yiken asked. "Then you'll have to die. No one can help you now." Black Sand raised his sword and used the tip to point at the patterns on Yiken and the others. The smile on his face made him look even more ferocious. His crimson eyes were filled with mockery. "You can summon the insects on your body too. Let me tell you. Those insects, I'll stomp them to death if they come. I'll stomp on a pair if they come. I'll stomp on as many as they come." Xiao Xian, who was watching the situation unfold, heard this and said silently, "You can't spout nonsense." Black Sand gripped the glowing sword in his hand. He felt as if he had stepped onto the stairs leading to the holy gate. He had become stronger and could trample on the opponents he disliked in the past. Yiken frowned. He was thinking of the best strategy to deal with the current situation. However, Black Sand wouldn't give him that much time to think. Rustle, rustle, rustle. The sound of sand sliding was exceptionally clear in such a stagnant atmosphere. A strange feeling suddenly rose in his heart. Black Sand stared at a certain spot behind Yiken and the others. His eyes widened and the expression on his face seemed to crack. Bit by bit, his expression changed stiffly. The hand holding the sword trembled. The people around them sucked in their breaths too. Their mouths were agape as if they had seen something horrifying and unbelievable. Yiken, who was guarding against Black Sand and didn't look behind him, quickly turned back. Not far behind them, a huge blue beetle crawled out from the sand. Chapter 745. Somewhere outside the town, behind a sand dune that wasn't too tall, was one of the dunes closest to the Viper's stronghold. There was nowhere to hide if they went any further. Here, Tar and the rest were waiting, keeping an eye on the town's movements. When they saw a burst of sand outside the town, they knew that Xiao Xian had seen them and was about to send them out. That was the signal they had agreed on earlier. The burst of sand came from Sapphire, who was waiting there. Cha-Cha in the sky flew towards the town when it saw the burst of sand. There weren't many large birds of prey in the desert. If Cha-Cha got too close to the group, it would expose their whereabouts. That was why, since they entered the desert, Cha-Cha had been moving freely most of the time. It did not get too close to the group, but it did not stray too far away either, so Xiao Xian could find it in time. After Xiao Xian threw the 5 Gongjia family members out, Cha-Cha swooped down from the sky and took them away. When they flew out of the town, they did not fly towards where Gongjia Ren and the rest were. Instead, they flew in a different direction. After shaking off the vipers who were chasing them, they turned back to meet up with Gongjia Ren. Gongjia Ren explained the situation of the Flaming Horn tribe to the 5 of them. Although his 5 companions were not in the best state of mind, they were still alive and had all their limbs intact. Given enough time to rest and eat, they would recover without any major problems. Gongjia Ren was relieved. It seemed like the Flaming Horn tribe was more powerful than he expected. They had made the right choice. If they could leave safely, Gongjia Ren would help Yanjiao forge weapons in return for Yanjiao's help. Now that they had saved their people, they had no more worries. If they encountered desert bandits again, the Yanjiao people would not have to worry about anything. They waited for Xiao Xian to return. However, after a while, there was a commotion in the town. Xiao Xian did not appear immediately, nor did he send out a signal for help. What should we do? Tuo looked at Ta. Should we go there? Although there were beetles, there were still quite a number of vipers. Xiao Xian alone might not be able to withstand the siege. Accidents were bound to happen. No, wait a little longer. Ta raised his hand to stop him. They hadn't received Xiao Xian's call for help. At the same time, something seemed to be wrong in the small town. Xiao Xian had said that he would send out a signal if there were any abnormalities. Since Xiao Xian did not do so, they continued to wait here. After all these years, Ta also knew that Xiao Xian was no longer the ignorant kid who followed behind the team. Xiao definitely knew what to do. They didn't need to do too much. They just needed to follow the plan. Pay attention to your surroundings, Ta said to everyone. They were now in a place with more desert bandits, so they had to be careful at all times. On the other side, in the small city of the Vipers, under everyone's watchful eyes, the giant blue beetle emerged from the sand. Yellow sand slid off its blue carapace, making hissing sounds. Sapphire's back height might only be considered medium-sized among the desert beasts. However, its overall shape was slightly flat and oval, resembling a giant inverted spoon. There wasn't enough space to accommodate it. As the giant beetle gradually emerged from the sand, the low sand house on the ground also collapsed amidst a series of rumbling sounds. The door woven from desert vines also emitted a fragile creaking sound as it collapsed, breaking off one by one. The people standing around had long retreated when they noticed the situation. They distanced themselves from the giant beetle that had appeared out of nowhere. Generally speaking, desert beasts rarely appeared in this area. After all, there were more and more desert bandits stationed here. Desert beasts would be rarer in places with more people, unless it was a more powerful giant beast. Sapphire's appearance had been categorized as the latter type of beast in everyone's mind. Xueqi had planned to take a quick glance behind him and continue watching Black Sand. He wanted to ambush Black Sand when he wasn't paying attention. It would be best if he could snatch the sword from Black Sand's hand. However, Xueqi didn't expect to see such a scene when he turned around. He was so shocked that he forgot his initial plan of ambushing Black Sand. Be it the Vipers or the Blue Beetles, they all stared at the pattern drawn on the Blue Beetle's body. They looked at the beetle on the pattern, then back at the one that had just appeared. Suddenly, they felt incredulous. The Vipers exclaimed, "This pattern is real." The Blue Beetles exclaimed, "This is real." Although every desert bandit group had their own pattern, it was only a wish, a symbol. They didn't treat it as real. Without faith, how could they believe in a pattern so easily? Take the Vipers for example. If they were to encounter a venomous snake in the desert, their first thought would be to kill it. If such a giant venomous snake appeared before them, they would definitely wet their pants. That was how the Blue Beetles were feeling now. The earliest batch of Blue Beetles had experienced the events of their escape years ago. They knew why Xueqi and the elders of the desert bandits decided on such a name. Back then, when the desert was in chaos, they escaped. If it wasn't for the Blue Beetle that scared off the pursuers, they would have been hacked to death long ago. Moreover, the giant Blue Beetle gave them a lot of good stuff. That was the beginning of the rise of the Blue Beetle Desert Bandits. As for those who joined the Blue Beetle Desert Bandits later on, although they had heard about it from others, very few of them actually believed it. Some of them thought that it was either fabricated or pure luck. Now, if those who told them the story of the Blue Beetle were here, they would have screamed, "You're lying! Didn't you say that the beetle was only as tall as a human? What's this thing that's here?" Recalling Black Sand's words, the Blue Beetles assumed that Xueqi had summoned it to help. They no longer cared about the legend. Their gazes towards Xueqi were filled with boundless reverence and confidence. So their leader still had a trick up his sleeve. Not only did he summon a giant blue beetle, it was even bigger than the one in the legends. On the other hand, the Vipers were horrified. They didn't expect the Blue Beetles to be prepared. Even Black Sand thought the same. Xueqi, who was equally shocked. Xueqi, of course, noticed everyone's gaze on him. He was both shocked and afraid. He really didn't summon this one. He had seen a giant blue beetle before, but it wasn't this big. He didn't dare to think about it. If this giant beetle's appearance was a coincidence and it attacked indiscriminately, would the Blue Beetle's desert bandits need to change their patterns in the future? The appearance of the giant blue beetle changed the atmosphere in an instant. It was like a piece of frozen ice that was suddenly thrown into boiling water and cracks began to appear. The sudden change in the situation brought about the same change in everyone's mood. Just as the Vipers and Blue Beetles were having mixed feelings, the giant blue beetle's entire body was revealed. Its shovel-like head turned slightly to scan its surroundings. Its gaze lingered on Xueqi for a few seconds. Xueqi's heart clenched. He knew better than anyone else what was going on. He was afraid that this giant beetle would attack them. However, Xueqi soon noticed that the giant beetle had shifted its gaze to Black Sand, who was standing there with a sword in hand. Other than the sound of sand being blown by the wind, there was silence. Everyone was waiting for the giant beetle's reaction. Even though they noticed that the giant beetle's pattern was similar to the Blue Beetle's desert bandits, they were still suspicious. The next moment, the giant blue beetle moved. It lifted its forelimb that resembled a long scythe and slammed it down on the sand. Unlike the slamming it did when it was hunting the sand lizards, its forelimb was now more extended. Like a black lightning bolt that fell from the sky, it struck the sand diagonally. The burst of air was like an invisible flying arrow. It shot from the point of impact to a certain direction. Wherever it passed, the sand on the sand was pushed to the sides. Xueqi stood still. He knew that he wasn't the target of this attack. He turned back to look at black sand. That was the true target of the giant blue beetle. This attack alone was enough to make Xueqi heave a sigh of relief. Thank goodness the giant beetle wasn't attacking him. When the giant beetle appeared, black sand was already on guard. The moment the giant beetle lifted its claw, he was ready to dodge the arrow-like air current. The air current hit the stone house behind black sand with a loud bang. The entire stone house shook. Sand, stone chips and rocks swooshed down. Fortunately, the sandstone house took a lot of effort to build, so it didn't collapse from this attack. However, if there were to be a few more attacks later on, there was no telling what would happen. Black Sand's heart ached for his mansion. He didn't want to fight here. Gritting his teeth, he stepped out quickly and headed to the other side. Sapphire had the same intention. Xueqi was still in the stone house. Sapphire regretted its decision to throw him out. No one noticed the two antennae on its head trembling. Due to its previous mistake of almost eating Xueqi's target, Sapphire wanted to do something to atone for its mistake. Hence, it put in more effort to focus on that target. As for the others, it didn't even spare them a glance. Swinging its 6 long legs vigorously, Sapphire chased after black sand. The sand kicked up by its long legs hit black sand painfully. Xueqi stopped chasing after black sand. He had the blue beetles move away. Noticing some small beetles crawling out from the sand, he hurriedly said, "Don't attack the beetles on the ground. Move away, move away." The people from the blue beetles did as they were told, while the people from the vipers used a stone spear to stab the beetle under their feet into the sand. Soon, there were 2, 3, 10 beetles, and even more beetles appearing around him. The man panicked. He screamed and clenched the stone spear in his hand, stabbing at the beetles on the ground. The more he stabbed, the more beetles there were. The surrounding beetles started to gather. Soon, they were like a small mountain, pushing the man up. His head and eyes couldn't be seen. At first, they could still see the man waving his stone spear and hear his screams. However, as the beetles continued to increase, they couldn't see anything else and his screams became softer. The black beetles were like a small wave, sweeping the man into it. When the black wave gradually receded, only a skeleton with tattered clothes was left. What little doubt they had was now shattered by this scene. Someone from the viper's side roared. "Insect swarm!" Like a ladle of water being poured into a burning pot of oil, it exploded with a bang. Insect tide! The insect tide is here! Run! The vipers couldn't care less about the blue beetles. If they encountered an insect tide in the desert, they would usually run away and stay far away. They didn't expect to encounter an insect tide in their lair. No, it was the blue beetles who brought the insect tide here. The blue beetles could trigger an insect tide. This realization made the vipers even more fearful. "Make them leave!" The vipers shouted at Xueqi. Unfortunately, the vipers' leader had been chased away by the giant beetle. The people here were no match for Xueqi. A group attack. But there were still so many beetles around. They were all man-eaters. To run or not to run? They watched as Xueqi beheaded the vipers one by one. The slain ones were quickly devoured by the beetles on the ground. Some of the blue beetles were bitten as well, but Xueqi didn't need to say anything. They all gathered around Xueqi, including those who were waiting outside the small town and rushed over after hearing the commotion. They all gathered around Xueqi. Xueqi stared at the densely packed black beetles on the ground, his heart pounding. He wasn't the elders. The elders believed in the totem and believed that the beetle would give them a chance to live a new life. Xueqi, on the other hand, had always been skeptical. However, a team needed a spiritual pillar, so when discussing the totem and name, he listened to the elders' suggestions. He wasn't confident about these insects either. Seeing that everyone was coming towards him, Xueqi could only brace himself and step forward. "Everyone, don't attack the beetles on the ground." Xueqi warned again. The person who felt a bite on his leg was about to chop the beetle, but after hearing Xueqi's warning, he could only shake his leg to shake the beetle off. To their surprise, The beetles ran away after taking a few steps towards them. They didn't come any closer. It worked. One of the blue beetles turned to look at Xueqi. Boss, this was summoned by you? The legendary disaster in the desert had actually helped them so peacefully and even helped them. This was unbelievable. They decided that they would repent properly when they returned. What if they were eaten by an insectide in the future? Xueqi was thinking the same thing, but he was still suspicious. They were slaves who had seen and experienced too much. He still couldn't believe everything that was happening before his eyes. Rumbling noises came from not far away. It was the battle between the giant blue beetle and black sand. They had no idea how it was going. You guys wait here. I'll go up and check on the situation over there. Xueqi wanted to jump onto the roof of the sandstone house, but before his feet could leave the ground, someone grabbed onto him. No. Boss, I want to follow you. The person who grabbed onto Xueqi's arm said anxiously. Yes. Boss, we'll follow you. The others beside him quickly chimed in. No need, I'll be fine alone. You guys wait here. Before Xueqi could finish, the others wailed and clutched onto Xueqi tightly. No, boss, don't leave us. They wailed so pitifully that it was as if they would be eaten if Xueqi left. But that was the truth. Once Xueqi left, the beetles who had been driven crazy by their thirst for blood began to attack indiscriminately. The only thing they wouldn't attack was Xueqi. As soon as Xueqi jumped onto the roof, the little beetles that were wandering around shrank their encirclement and approached. Seeing this, the people below waved at Xueqi. Boss, help! Some even jumped onto the roof. Xueqi leaped down from the roof and the approaching beetles retreated. This scene wasn't only witnessed by the blue beetles but also the vipers. The beetles didn't eat Xueqi and seemed to be avoiding him on purpose. Realizing this, some of the vipers began to ponder. Life was the most important thing. One of the vipers ran towards Xueqi, shouting as he ran, I'll join you. I'll join the blue beetles. With the first, there would be the second, the third. Although they were worried that their betrayal would anger Black Sand, their lives were more important. Those who followed the blue beetles now wouldn't be eaten by the insect swarm. Plus, Black Sand might not end well. That giant beetle wasn't easy to deal with. Seeing more and more vipers clamoring to join the blue beetles turned to Xueqi and waited for their leader to make the decision. They all knew that the vipers were forced by the insect swarm, but this wasn't a bad thing for the blue beetles. At least for the current situation, it was a good thing. Let's not talk about loyalty. Now, the desert bandits were competing on who had more people. Xueqi, who was surrounded by the crowd like a protective umbrella, was feeling rather complicated. Xueqi was more surprised than anyone else. It was actually true. Could it be that the protection the elders mentioned was real? Sensing something, Xueqi whipped his head around to look at the sandstone house. His gaze swept from the door to the few windows. There was no one else in sight, but plenty of black beetles were swarming in through the windows. Those who wanted to hide in the house changed their minds. Leader, what are you looking at? One of the blue beetles asked Xueqi. Xueqi shook his head. Nothing. He just felt like someone was watching them, but when he looked over, he didn't see anything. Xiao Xian, who was originally in the sandstone house, had already made his way to Sapphire. Bang! The sand on the sandy ground splashed up like a reverse waterfall. Black Sand gripped his sword tightly and sliced the oncoming sand waterfall. The sand rubbed against the blade, producing a piercing sound. It was like sharp gravel scraping against one's heart, piercing one's eardrums. Black Sand's meridians expanded. Ever since he broke free from his shackles, other than his physical body becoming stronger, every time he used the energy within his body, his strength would increase exponentially. It was like a totem warrior activating his totemic power. However, unlike a totem warrior, although he had seized the power for his own use, he hadn't fully absorbed it. Every time he used that power, his emotions would easily become irritable. Fortunately, he controlled himself and didn't lose his rationality. Although there were side effects, the increase in his strength was undeniable. Black Sand dodged the giant beetle's long claws. The muscles on his arms expanded again, increasing his strength. Black Sand's eyes turned blood-red and bulged outwards as if they were about to bleed. He stared at the giant blue figure not far away. 10 fingers gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. His feet shook the ground and he bent his legs into a squat. His arched back revealed his protruding vertebrae. His joints moved up and down continuously, emitting a series of creaking sounds. In the next moment, he charged towards the giant beetle like a cannonball. The strength of his muscles and bones mixed with the condensed energy within his body. The large beetle raised its two front limbs again, intending to use the sand waterfall to block the sword momentum. Just as its two long scythe-like legs were about to touch the sand, Heisha's legs suddenly rotated, and the sand was shoveled into the air. The twisting force caused his body to turn in an instant, dodging the sand waterfall. Meanwhile, Heisha himself appeared at the side of the large beetle, and his fierce killing intent rushed towards the large beetle. Black Sand knew that he couldn't win against the giant beetle in terms of strength. However, he didn't want to give up his territory and run away. He wanted to use the sword in his hand to cut down the giant beetle. However, every time he rushed over, he would be blocked by the giant beetle's sand waterfall. Therefore, he decided to change his strategy. The giant beetle's actions must be because it was afraid of the sword in his hand. Black Sand's confidence grew. His target was the giant beetle's head. Without its head, how could this giant beetle survive? It wasn't like those monsters created by Rock Hill City. Clang! The strong force collided, producing a crisp sound like metal clashing. The force of the vibration transmitted to the bones of the hand holding the sword, producing a cracking sound. Black Sand's two arms were also repelled by the brute force. Black Sand's pupils shrank. He didn't hit. His target was the giant beetle's head. However, when he struck, the beetle seemed to be prepared. It used its other two pairs of legs and its body spun like a top. In an instant, it turned at an angle. The part that was originally facing the blade changed from its head to its carapace. And the carapace was the toughest part of the beetle's body. The sword in Black Sand's hand actually only left a shallow mark on its back when the blade of the sword slashed at its back armor. After being repelled by the force of the rebound, Black Sand didn't have time to do anything. The carapace had already crashed into him. Bam! Black Sand was sent flying. The strength in his body was already unstable. With this collision, his chi and blood were in turmoil. He spat out a mouthful of blood. Blood also seeped out of his eyes. The failure of the surprise attack and the mark on the carapace had shaken Black Sand's confidence. After sending him flying, Sapphire's two hind legs kicked. Its body, which looked as cumbersome as an armored vehicle, moved forward rapidly on the sand. One of its forelimbs was already lashing out like a whip. Black Sand was still in the air and had yet to land. Without wings, he couldn't dodge even if he wanted to. He had no other choice but to raise his sword to block. Bam! The toothed forelimb swept across like a heavy axe. It shook off the obstruction in the air and slammed heavily on the sword. A powerful force followed Black Sand's hand that was holding the sword hilt and rushed straight to his arm. Crack! After his fingers were broken, the bones in his arm made a crisp cracking sound. Even the vertebrae on his back were exploding continuously, as if they couldn't hold on any longer. As for Black Sand himself, he was smashed into the sand by this blow. The resulting sand flow scattered like water splashes. Chapter 746. The power in Black Sand's body was in disarray. The arm holding the sword was weak and he had no choice but to switch to another hand. Just as he got up, the giant beetle was already in front of him. It raised its two front limbs and did not give Black Sand any time to breathe. Heisha felt his scalp go numb from the pressure brought about by the large beetle. Every muscle in his body was trembling, and there was no time for him to dodge. He could only raise his arm and place his sword horizontally in front of him, blocking the attack that was already in front of him. Bang! Black Sand was almost completely smashed into the sand. He could not hold his sword steadily. If it was not for the fact that his body was much stronger, anyone else would have been smashed to death. Even so, Black Sand was barely holding on. He did not even have time to breathe. Heisha smelled the scent of death. Previously, he thought that after breaking free from his shackles, he would no longer have such a feeling. But now he felt it. Fear flashed through his scarlet eyes that were oozing blood. He did not want to die. He still wanted to unify this scattered land of desert bandits. He even fantasized about one day taking over Rock Hill City's territory and controlling the entire desert. But now, he could only helplessly endure the fierce and murderous smashes again and again. Sapphire's attack was actually very simple. In the beginning, it did not know the strength of Black Sand's weapon and tested it a few times. But once it confirmed Black Sand and the sword's capabilities, its attack method was very clear. Especially now, when black sand was weak, Sapphire did not slack off and did not hold back. There were no superfluous movements. It was simple and straightforward. It smashed again and again. After smashing into the sand, Sapphire would pull him up from the sand and smash him again. If one smash did not kill him, Sapphire would smash him a few more times. Just like when Sapphire was chasing after those sand lizards, Sapphire would fish you out first before hitting you again. Unless you were really nailed to death, Sapphire would not relax. This was because many times, when Sapphire thought that the prey did not have the strength to stand up and was about to turn it into a ball, it would realize that the prey had escaped. In order to avoid such mistakes, Sapphire's two front limbs did not stop. Rumbling sounds came from the sand. Sandflowers bloomed and fell. Potholes appeared and were flattened. When Black Sand heard the sound of his bones breaking, his consciousness gradually blurred. He could no longer feel the pain in his body. He regretted his decision. He should not have forced the blue beetles into a corner. Otherwise, the blue beetles would not have summoned the giant beetle. Or perhaps, he should have fled the moment the giant beetle appeared. Even if he lost his territory and his subordinates, with his ability and the sword in his hand, he could quickly rebuild a new group of desert bandits in the desert. Even before his death, Black Sand believed that the giant blue beetle was summoned by Xueqi. Sapphire finally stopped its attack. Its shovel-like head twitched as if it was thinking of what to do with this person. Its two paddle-shaped antennae moved. It wanted to wrap the prey into a ball, but the prey was too small. It would only be a small ball even if it was wrapped into a ball. While Sapphire was hesitating, Xueqi gave it a command. In the end, Sapphire did not manage to turn the black sand into a ball. It extended its forelimbs to scoop up the object that had been smashed into the sand and left. After Sapphire left, a swarm of black beetles crawled out from the sand and swarmed towards the unrecognizable person. Heisha had eaten many people before. Even his blood relatives were not spared when he was still on the run. Men, women, the elderly, and children, he had eaten them all. However, he had never thought that he would be eaten by a group of insects one day. The Viper Man, who was huddled in a low sand house, saw the situation through the gap of the half-blocked vent. He shrunk into a corner of the house. He did not dare to go out. Even Black Sand had been eaten by the insects. He would not be able to escape their jaws. At this moment, there were more than 300 people surrounding Xueqi. Those at the edge were too far away from Xueqi and were bitten from time to time. However, they did not dare to attack the beetles. For one, they were afraid of being bitten harder. For another, they were worried that the blue beetles would kick them to the side to fend for themselves. The blue beetles had always swallowed their pride when they were bitten. There were even some who were fighting for a spot closer to the center. Xueqi never knew that he was so popular. Even his own subordinates used to be afraid of him due to his strength. Now, their fear was mixed with respect. He knew what these people were thinking, but he really did not summon the giant beetle, nor did he do anything else. It's retreating. The insect swarm is retreating. Someone shouted from the periphery. It's retreating. It's really retreating. More people were ecstatic. The Viper Man's first thought was their leader, Black Sand. Since the insect swarm had retreated, what happened to Black Sand? Did he win or lose the battle with the giant beetle? The black beetles that were lingering nearby either burrowed into the sand or left immediately. Earlier, there was a sea of darkness, but now, there was only sand left. There were also some collapsed sandhouses nearby and some gnawed skeletons. Some of the Viper Man took 2 tentative steps outside but did not encounter any more black beetles. Leader. The insect swarm has retreated. Does that mean the giant beetle has left too? A blue beetle asked Xueqi. Xueqi pushed through the crowd in front of him and walked out. The others followed closely behind Xueqi. Although they did not see the beetles, they were still worried. It was safest to stay by Xueqin's side. Xueqi paused and continued forward. He jumped onto the roof and peered into the distance. No, it's not. It's still here. Just as Xueqin's words fell, the people who had walked far away retreated back. They refused to leave even after being threatened with knives by the blue beetles. The insect swarm hasn't retreated. It's just left and stopped nearby. It seems to be waiting for something. Xueqi jumped off the roof and said, "The little beetles didn't leave." In other words, the giant blue beetle was still there. The giant blue beetle had left after Black Sand. Now that the sounds of fighting could no longer be heard, did Black Sand run away or was he killed by the giant blue beetle? No matter which of the two possibilities it was good news for Xueqi. He grew increasingly nervous. His Adam's apple bobbed and sweat mixed with sand slid down his back. His eyes were fixed on his surroundings while his ears listened carefully to the surrounding sounds. Rustle, rustle, rustle. Something seemed to be approaching. It came from beneath his feet. The surroundings were silent. Everyone's hearts were trembling. The sound was getting closer. It seemed like the other party had no intention of hiding its tracks. On the sand, a blue carapace peeked out. Everyone held their breaths. Some wanted to run, but after what happened earlier, they hesitated when they lifted their feet. After a moment of struggle, they retracted their feet. Their bodies began to tremble. The giant blue beetle that appeared before Xueqi had no other obvious wounds other than scratches on its carapace. It looked fine. However, the thing it was biting on attracted everyone's attention. It was a sword, the one Black Sand used to hold. If the sword was here, did that mean Black Sand was dead? Everyone had their own guesses, but they had to admit that those who stayed here were relieved. The blue beetles felt that Black Sand was no longer a threat. The vipers, on the other hand, believed that Black Sand would be no match for Xueqi without the sword. Hence, their betrayal didn't need to be wary of Black Sand. Not knowing why the giant beetle appeared here again, Xueqi didn't dare to move. He stood there stiffly. He wasn't the one who summoned the beetle. He wasn't sure if the giant beetle would attack him after killing Black Sand. The giant blue beetle bit on the sword and moved towards Xueqi. The people gathered around Xueqi quickly retreated. Some of the blue beetles stood in front of Xueqi. Xueqi patted them and gestured for them to move aside, leaving Xueqi to face the approaching giant beetle alone. Xueqi felt the pressure of facing such a creature alone, but he had no choice but to stand here. He watched the approaching giant beetle and thought of a possibility. His gaze was fixed on the sword in the giant beetle's mouth. His heartbeat quickened uncontrollably and his palms were sweating. The giant beetle bit on the sword and approached Xueqi. It leaned in as if trying to discern something. Its paddle-like antennae twitched, giving Xueqi the illusion that he would be flattened in the next moment. The others didn't dare to breathe too loudly. After a while, the giant blue beetle loosened its grip and the sword fell to the sand beside Xueqi's feet. After dropping the sword, the giant blue beetle turned and left. Xueqi looked at the sword beside his feet. He squatted down and gripped the hilt with trembling hands. There were some scratches on the blade, but they weren't deep. The blade wasn't damaged either. Xueqi's palm brushed across the blade, wiping away the sand on it. The blade was still shiny, carrying with it a sense of holiness. The sun was still blazing above his head, but the blade was chilly. It was as warm as the sand underground. Lifting his head to look at the blue beetle that was gradually disappearing into the distance, the sunlight reflected off its back was tinged with a faint blue hue. Xueqi's hand on the sword hilt shifted from a grip to a support while his other hand rested on the sword. Lifting the golden-patterned sword with both hands, he knelt on the sand that was heated by the sun and bowed towards the departing blue figure. Seeing this, the other blue beetles knelt down in unison, bowing towards the departing blue figure. At this moment, they seemed to have realized something that they had heard of but never experienced before. It was something called faith. Many of them had ancestors who were slaves. They only heard about the tribe from their ancestors when they were alone. Therefore, they didn't understand the tribesmen's feelings of totem worship. But now they seemed to have touched it. The patterns drawn on their arms, chests, backs and other places seemed to carry a scorching heat that was branded into their hearts. The patterns that used to be laughable had now become sacred, just like how they were now bowing towards the giant blue figure. Perhaps, this bit of faith would be able to support them to survive in the desert. While the blue beetles knelt down in unison, the vipers exchanged glances. Kneel or not? Would they be eaten if they didn't? It was better to kneel. Since they had chosen to join the blue beetles and their leader had knelt, how could they still stand? If they didn't show their loyalty now, when would they? Hence, after the blue beetles, the vipers who had chosen to side with them knelt down as well. Under the worship of hundreds of people, the giant blue beetle left and disappeared under the sand. The little beetles that lingered nearby also left, burrowing into the sand. Soon, they were nowhere to be seen. This time, the insect tide had really retreated. It had completely retreated. When there was not a single beetle to be seen, Xueqi stood up with his sword in hand. He stared ahead with a deep gaze, feeling as if he had been reborn. He was beginning to understand what the elders had said. After ordering his subordinates to count those who had chosen to side with them, Yaiken walked into the sandstone house. This morning, it was still Black Sand's mansion. Now, it had a new owner. However, Yaiken didn't think much of this place. He walked towards a stone table. On it was a piece of animal skin that Black Sand had written earlier. On it was written the terms of cooperation. It was a cooperation, but all the terms listed on it treated the blue beetles as slaves. This was also why Yaiken didn't agree to it. Before the giant blue beetle appeared, under Black Sand's coercion, the others looked at him and waited for him to make a decision. Perhaps some of them wanted to agree at the last minute and think of a solution after this hurdle. However, Yaiken knew that as long as he agreed now, Black Sand would hand over the agreement he had written long ago and return them to their status as slaves. Even if the giant blue beetle hadn't appeared, Yaiken wouldn't have agreed. He was even prepared to fight to the death, but he didn't expect. A slight pain came from his palm. Frowning, Yaiken wiped the blood on his palm onto the animal skin. Then, he swung his sword and chopped the animal skin into pieces. Walking out of the sandstone house, Yaiken lifted his head and looked in a direction. That was where the Sky Waters Desert Robbers' underground palace was located. They had experienced despair and all sorts of hardships. In the future, they would experience even more glorious things. The Desert Robbers' location was going to be a huge storm. Xiao Xian didn't plan to ask about the Desert Robbers' plans. The presence of Desert Robbers would definitely pose a threat to Rock Hill City. Even if the current leader of the Desert Robbers wasn't experienced enough and their strength hadn't really improved, they would pose a threat to other forces in the desert in the future. It would be best if they could restrain Rock Hill City. As for Sapphire, the sacred relic that Yaiken and the others worshipped, it was here because Xiao Xian asked it to. Of course, Xiao Xian wasn't just here for the two desert robber groups. He had Sapphire fight with Black Sand because he wanted Black Sand to be Sapphire's whetstone. After unlocking Sapphire's fourth lock, Xiao Xian didn't know how capable it would be. He needed to test it out in real combat. Besides, Sapphire lived in the desert. The enhancement and physical changes brought about by the fourth lock were all to adapt to the desert environment. It was suitable for survival here and there were more beetles around it. It couldn't follow Xiao Xian to Yanjiao's headquarters. If Xiao Xian brought Sapphire out of the desert to other places, Sapphire wouldn't be able to unleash its full potential. Therefore, Xiao Xian didn't plan to bring it out of the desert. This was the most suitable place for it. However, there were still people from Rock Hill City in the desert, as well as many scattered bands of desert bandits. Perhaps the bandits had yet to develop and their leaders hadn't had enough time to improve, but humans were complex and cunning. In order to survive in the desert, Sapphire needed to understand more. Sapphire could learn all of these through its battle with Black Sand. Although Black Sand had broken through his shackles, which meant he had truly taken over the power his former slave master had given him. However, the power in his body wasn't stable enough. He hadn't developed enough as a whole. Just like a tribesman who had just merged with a fire seed, he hadn't fully absorbed the fire seed's power. Currently, Black Sand didn't have the upper hand against Sapphire. This was why Xiao Xian didn't worry about Sapphire testing the waters. However, Black Sand's sword could cause some damage to Sapphire. Although it wasn't as good as Heng's sword, it was still a sword made by the Gongjia family. It could be used as a personal signature sword. It wasn't easy to leave a scratch on Sapphire's back. Xiao Xian wanted Sapphire to know that creatures that looked weaker than it could still fight back. They could even use tricks. Sapphire needed to come up with a countermeasure too. When one's power wasn't absolute, one needed to be smarter. The insect swarm was eye-catching enough. Xiao Xian hoped Sapphire could learn more from this experience. This was his first slave. Xiao Xian didn't want it to become cannon fodder in the desert. Fortunately, Sapphire was smart. When it first created the sand waterfall, it looked like it was defending and attacking, but in reality, it was testing Black Sand and the sword. The sand in the sand waterfall rubbed against the sword, allowing Sapphire to understand the sword's general condition. It could confirm whether it could withstand the attack with its back armor. Once it confirmed that the sword couldn't really hurt it, it seized the opportunity and Black Sand could forget about escaping. Searching for food in the desert was never easy. Beasts would cherish every opportunity. Hence, Black Sand couldn't escape even if he wanted to. As for why the beetles didn't attack Yaiken, it was because Sapphire told them not to get close to Yaiken. With the beetles' abilities, they couldn't differentiate between too many people and execute overly complicated orders. Hence, it was impossible for Xiao Xian to have them all avoid the blue beetles. Hence, he settled for the next best thing, which was to avoid Yiken. Xiao Xian was interested in the blue beetles, but Sapphire no longer remembered them. Xiao Xian couldn't understand the truth. If Xiao Xian wasn't here, the insect swarm would have attacked indiscriminately. In fact, Yiken would have followed in Black Sand's footsteps. After this incident, Xiao Xian told Sapphire to remember Yiken's scent. If it encountered his men in the future, as long as they didn't attack Sapphire, it wouldn't lead the insect swarm to attack Yiken's men. After all, their totem was the blue dung ball-pushing beetle. Since the blue beetles regarded Sapphire as their religion, it was best to let this misunderstanding continue. Outside Viper's small town, skeletons could be seen occasionally. They belonged to people who failed to escape when the insect swarm appeared. Xiao Xian returned to where Yan Jiao's men were waiting. "Are you okay?" Ta and the others hurried over to ask. They heard the commotion in the small town and saw the insect swarm. Ta said that he wouldn't make a move until Xiao Xian gave the signal. As expected, the insect swarm appeared not long after. They didn't dare to step into the area where the insect swarm occurred. They weren't Xiao Xian, they wouldn't be attacked by the insect swarm. Many of the snake tribesmen ran out in all directions. Some ran in this direction, and the flaming horn tribesmen killed them on the spot. Otherwise they would be exposed. Xiao Xian had the beetles deal with the corpses on the ground. Once they were buried in the sand, there was no trace of them. They couldn't stay here for long. Perhaps the blue beetles would arrive soon to take over the remaining viper forces. Not many people knew about Xiao Xian's relationship with the insect swarm. At least, the desert robbers didn't know. Perhaps they would find out in the future, but for now, it was best not to tell them. Viper's small town wasn't a good place to rest. It made the 5 captured men nervous. They would rather sleep on the sand than go to the small town. Coincidentally, the Yanjiao people didn't want to be with the desert robbers either. They left and headed out of the desert. Gongjia Ren and the other 5 were on Sapphire's back. After receiving food and water and applying medicine to their wounds, they felt much better after some rest. Elder Xiao Xian. Gongjia Kan, the oldest of the 5, spoke carefully. "What is it?" Xiao Xian looked at Gongjia Kansas, that traitor. Gongjia Kan was referring to the traitor of the Gongjia family. "He's been eaten," said Xiao Xian. He watched as the man was swallowed by the insect swarm. Hearing that the traitor had been eaten by the insects, the 6 Gongjia members heaved a sigh of relief. At least the traitor had been punished. However, they soon sighed. They were all implicated and forced to come out. Who would have thought that the traitor would betray them and even lead the desert bandits to capture them, only to end up like this? "Why? Do you feel bad?" said Lei. If a Yanjiao member betrayed his own family, he would be hunted down. Even if he escaped far away, we would do everything we could to kill him. Like that person, the one who betrayed his own family and sought refuge with a slave master? Dao Yu said to all. Yes, that's him. Dao Yu. Even though he sought refuge with the slave master and lived well in the desert, didn't he get killed by Xian in the end? When Lei mentioned Dao Yu, Xiao Xian thought of what happened back then. If it was as he guessed, Dao Yu was considered dead but had not disappeared. He was just alive in another state. Somewhere in the desert, a team of 200 people walked on the sand. Unlike the desert robbers, this team's formation was more unique. The most eye-catching was, of course, the giant golden beast walking in the middle. The giant beast was oval-shaped, but not as flat as Sapphire. It was longer, and when it walked, one could see rings of expansion and contraction marks on its back, as if it was made up of several sections. The seemingly heavy back armor armed most of its body, with long legs protruding from its body. There were many legs, supporting the entire body's movements. On the back of this giant beast, there was a metal frame covered with some cloth curtains, blocking Yang Guang. It looked like a small house with a person lying on a wide chair. "Have you found the person?" A lazy voice came from inside. A short and fat figure quickly approached the giant beast, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He said respectfully, "Third young master, not yet." Above, the cloth curtains were lifted and a hard, fist-sized fruit core was thrown out, mercilessly smashing towards the man's head. A cold voice followed. "Then hurry up and find him." Chapter 747. After receiving the 6 Gongjia members, the Yanjiao people did not stay any longer. They left the desert as quickly as possible. Just because they did not encounter any obstacles before, It did not mean that things would go smoothly later on. Just like before, they spent more time traveling at night and would rest during the day. Sometimes, they would sleep less because they were in a hurry. When they were hunting in the forest, the Yanjiao warriors would occasionally stay up all night. They were just not used to the desert environment, so their speed was limited. However, they still had the stamina to travel. On the way back, the Yanjiao people told the Gongjia members about the Yanjiao tribe's living conditions. Gongjia Ran and the rest had planned to live in a tribe that hunted all day long, hidden in the depths of the forest. They would live in simple houses made of wood and stone, use metal tools they no longer used, wear old, coarse linen clothes, and live with a group of barbaric tribesmen. However, the more they listened, the more they felt that something was amiss. So the Yanjiao people did not live in the depths of the forest? So the Yanjiao people did not only live in simple houses made of wood and stone? So other than hunting, the Yanjiao people also knew how to farm. Their farmlands were not small, and they even reared domesticated animals. So the Yanjiao people had their own trading area? And it was a trading area built like a city? What surprised them even more was the new bronze weapons in the Yanjiao people's hands, and Xiao Xian's knife of unknown material. In terms of hardness, even the best Gongjia Ren was not confident that his sword could beat Yanjiao's new bronze weapons. Unbelievable! Were these the tribesmen they had imagined? During their conversation with the Gongjia members, the Yanjiao people noticed that these people's impression of the tribesmen was so backward. This was intolerable. Although their tribe used to be like that, Yanjiao had changed drastically. The Yanjiao people were very angry at Gongjia Ren and the rest's opinion of the Yanjiao people. The 6 people were already stunned by the scene described by the Yanjiao people. When they saw that the expressions of the Yanjiao people weren't very good, they knew that they must have offended these people and hurriedly explained. "I'm sorry, we've been staying in the royal city for a long time so we don't know much about tribesmen's lives." Gongjia Ren was embarrassed too. The tribesmen he had heard about were really like that. On the other side of the sea, other than the slave masters and nobles who built cities, there were also various organizations and groups that no longer lived as tribes. The 6 Gongjia members were familiar with these, but for the tribesmen who lived in the depths of the forest, far away from cities, and maintained a primitive tribal state, what they heard from others was vastly different from what the Yanjiao people described. Perhaps it was just as Hang had said. Yanjiao was a good place. Things there might not be as bad as before. They had always thought that the tribesmen were lacking in metal weapons. Perhaps there would be a shortage of resources when the time came. However, according to Ta, they had hoarded a lot of metal weapons and even robbed a lot of them. Although they didn't have much resources, it was enough for them to fight. Since they knew that the tribe they were going to rely on was not bad, the most important thing was that they would have the opportunity to showcase their talents and have their own forge. That would be enough. The 6 Gongjia members were looking forward to the new life they were about to live. Their mood improved and they started to talk more with the Yanjiao people. "The most important thing for you to live here is to master the language here. Not every tribe knows the language there," said Xiao Xian. The Yanjiao people knew the language on the other side of the sea and could converse with the 6 Gongjia members because Zhang Luo and the other half of the tribe had influenced each other. Moreover, the people Xiao Xian brought along this time also knew some of the language so they wouldn't be unable to understand the Gongjia members' cries for help. However, once they left the desert and entered the tribesmen's territory, they would have to do as the Romans do. Indeed. Gongjia Ren nodded. They had to learn this language. Since they had nothing to do during the journey, the 6 Gongjia members followed the Yanjiao people to learn the language and writing used by the tribesmen. Sometimes, they would even write on the sand when they rested. The medicine the Yanjiao people gave them was of better quality. Now, the 6 Gongjia members could walk and jog. However, they had not fully recovered and could not keep up with the Yanjiao people's speed. That was why they were still on Sapphire's back. "We'll be out of the desert in about 5 to 6 days, said Ta. 5 to 6 days was not a long time. Gongjia Ran and the rest had spent much longer in the desert and it was much more difficult. Compared to before, it was much easier now. 5 to 6 days was nothing. "Be careful," said Xiao Xian suddenly. Ta and the rest who were drinking water were stunned. "We'll run into trouble?" Xiao Xian crushed the straw rope in his hand and threw it into the sand. He mixed it with his foot. At first glance, it was difficult to separate the straw shreds from the dry sand. "We can't avoid it?" asked Ta. "It'll be difficult. They might have followed us here." Xiao Xian thought of the Bai Luo he met before. He knew that slave masters who had lived in the desert for thousands of years must have many beasts that were good at tracking. They might even have other methods. It would not be easy to shake them off. After hearing Xiao Xian's words, the rest became serious. Rock Hill City, asked Tuo. It should be them. Anyway, everyone be careful. Gongjia Ren and the rest were puzzled as to why Xiao Xian could predict what would happen. However, seeing how trusting the Yanjiao people were and how serious the atmosphere in the group was, they did not dare to ask questions. After all, it was for their sake. After that, the group became much quieter. The 6 Gongjia Ren members stopped asking questions because the flaming horns were too focused on guarding their surroundings. They had no time to chat with them. I heard that Rock Hill City created some monsters that can't be killed. Have you guys seen them? Asked Lei. Gongjia Ren shook his head. We've only seen them once from afar. I don't know if they really can't be killed, but after being cut in half, their upper bodies could still move nimbly. They didn't bleed and their bodies were black. When they crossed the sea, there was a chaotic battle there. They took a detour and took a boat. They had only seen them once from afar and it was a very strange scene. The Gongjia members felt chills run down their spines. It was no wonder Royal City had received news that the battle was not going well. Anyone would be afraid of those monsters. When the Flaming Horn tribesmen heard that these monsters would not die even after being cut in half, and that they could even use their arms to move around as if they could not feel any pain, even if the Flaming Horn tribesmen were mentally prepared, they still felt a layer of goosebumps on their arms. Not even cutting off their heads? Asked Tuo. I don't know. Gongjia Ran and the rest really did not know. They had used all their means to avoid the battlefield and their pursuers. They did not pay much attention to the monsters at the time. They did not even have time to run for their lives, let alone observe if the monsters could still move after their heads were cut off. They can, said Xiao Xian. The Yanjiao members and the Gongjia members all looked at Xiao Xian. Other than Ta, who knew part of the reason, the rest did not know. Those monsters have no internal organs, including their hearts. Their heads are not the core of their bodies. Of course, cutting off their heads will definitely affect them, but they can still move. Xiao Xian continued, that's why if you encounter them, you can first cut off their heads, then their limbs. However, they will not die, so you must be careful. There might be a sneak attack with a severed arm or something. Everyone felt their hair stand on end at Xiao Xian's words. Gongjia Ren even touched his neck unconsciously. When he heard Xiao Xian say cut off their limbs, he touched his arm again. He felt his hair stand on end. After all, they grew up in a different environment from the Yanjiao people. These words were more impactful to them. Although the Yanjiao members were horrified, they still remembered Xiao Xian's words. Remember, they are just puppets. They are controlled by someone. They have no life, they cannot bleed, they do not feel pain and they do not have self-awareness. Other than their strong bodies, they are no different from withered wood. The key lies in the person controlling them. If there is a chance, I will kill the person controlling the puppets first, continued Xiao Xian. The Yanjiao members nodded, indicating that they remembered. Since those puppets could not be considered human and were no different from wood, they would treat these dead humans the same way they treated wood. Under everyone's vigilance, they walked for another 2 days. On this day, Xiao Xian heard the cry of an eagle in the distance. It was the cry of a cha-cha. They're here. Xiao Xian looked in a direction. They're fast. Soon, Ta sensed someone approaching at a speed much faster than their speed. It was no wonder Xiao Xian said they might not be able to avoid it. The Yanjiao members were on high alert. In the distance, where the sand met the sky, dust began to roll. A giant figure reflected the golden light, the most eye-catching of all. It was a giant oval-shaped beast. From the reflection of the light, one could tell that its entire body was covered in hard armor. There were people on the back of the giant beast, but they were blocked by a cloth curtain, so one could not see who was inside. There were other people around the giant golden beast, all wearing golden armor. They were very similar to the Jinjiao guards Xiao Xian had seen before. Xiao Xian's gaze swept over the people closest to the giant beast. Although they were all wearing armor and gave Xiao Xian a similar feeling to the Jinjiao guards, Xiao Xian was more concerned about the people running on the periphery. Those people were wearing thick cotton clothes and looked very low-key. Even their heads were covered. If they were ordinary people, they would definitely be sweating from wearing such clothes and running so vigorously under such a hot sun. The people wearing golden armor around the giant beast were relatively normal. One could see that they were tired, but these people didn't seem to feel it at all. They didn't seem to be tired at all. It was them. They were the legendary freaks. Only those who no longer had self-awareness, knew no pain, knew no fatigue, and knew no cold or heat could move like a machine. Even the movement of their feet was neat and tidy. If that was all, they would look more like well-trained soldiers. In reality, they were just puppets. Now that they were close, the sand and dust had limited cover. A gust of wind could be seen. There were about 200 people. Among these 200 people, there were 100 people in armor and close to 100 freaks. They were split evenly between the two sides. Seeing that there was a giant beast, the 6 Gongjia members dismounted from Sapphire's back. Sapphire was obviously going to participate in the battle and could not carry them all the time. Moreover, they could walk and run now. They held the new bronze weapons given by the Yanjiao people and stood together. The Yanjiao people surrounded them in the middle. The troop was getting closer and closer, only slowing down when they were 100 meters away. They walked forward a little more before stopping. The people of the Flaming Horn tribe noticed that the 100 people closest to the giant beast could clearly hear the sound of their breathing after they stopped. Even though they were wearing armor, they could see the rise and fall of their chests. Even the giant beast seemed to be panting. When it lowered its head, the sand on the ground was blown up. However, the people standing at the periphery were not even breathing, let alone panting. After they stopped, they stood there stiffly like they were made of wood. Due to the thick linen cloth, their faces could not be seen clearly. However, the Yanjiao people had already guessed that these people were the freaks everyone was talking about. When Sapphire saw the giant beast, it walked to Xiao Xian's side and raised its 2 long forelimbs, looking at the giant beast threateningly. It was difficult for giant beasts to get along with each other. Hand over the Gongjia people. A cold voice came from the back of the giant golden armored beast. They could not see the person's face through the cloth, but they could hear the thick arrogance and disdain in the voice. Without waiting for an answer, the person continued. Which one of you is Gongjia Ren? Step forward. Xiao Xian raised an eyebrow. Ta and the rest's expressions changed too. Why did the person only call out Gongjia Ren's name? However, they did not look at Gongjia Ren. Xiao Xian waved his hand behind his back, indicating that they did not need to answer. The person waited for a while but did not receive a reply. His voice lowered again, this time with an obvious threat. Which one is Gongjia Ren? If you don't answer, you'll all die. Xiao Xian thought carefully about the voice. It sounded familiar, but it had been too long since they last met. And who are you? Asked Xiao Xian. Shut up. You haven't answered the young master's question. An armored man took 2 steps forward, pointing at Xiao Xian as he shouted. Then, a slightly gloomy voice came from behind the cloth on the insect's back. Second young master, don't waste time. Kill a few people first and they'll talk. You're right. It was the same voice from before, but it did not have the arrogance it had when facing Xiao Xian and the rest. It seemed to be afraid of the person who spoke. Second young master? Luoya City's second young master, Su Lu? Xiao Xian suddenly remembered this person. When they first entered the desert, they were in Luoya City. Luoya City's king, Su Luan, had 3 sons. The first young master, Su Ka, second young master, Su Lu, and third young master, Su Gu. They were half-brothers, but their relationship was like fire and water. Back then, it was because of Xiao Xian that Su Gu snatched the spot that should have been Su Li's to go to Beast City. As soon as Xiao Xian spoke, the man on the golden beast's back lifted the cloth curtain and looked down. Then his eyes turned sharp and cold. Yanjiao Xiao Xian? Every word was squeezed out from the gaps between his teeth. Even Gongjia Ran and the rest could feel the intense hatred. The rest of Yanjiao looked at Xiao Xian, asking with their eyes, does this person have a grudge against you? Even Xiao Xian did not expect Su Lu to remember him. It had been so long, but he still remembered him so clearly. Of course, Su Lu remembered it clearly. If it weren't for Xiao Xian, Su Gu wouldn't have had the opportunity to follow his father to the Beast City. He wouldn't have been qualified to participate in some important affairs, and he wouldn't have had the opportunity to develop to the point where he could compete with him today. Su Lu was a vengeful person. Even if it had been a long time, he would still remember those who had offended him. Of course, he remembered Xiao Xian. While Su Lu and Xiao Xian were confronting each other, somewhere further away, a team similar to Su Li's was also advancing. Even the giant beast was of the same species. A short and fat person trembled and ran to the side of the golden beast. He said to the man on the beast's back, "Third young master, there's news. Hurry up and tell me. Did the other team find him first?" The man lying on the beast's back casually picked up a fruit and took a big bite, as if venting his anger. The other team had taken the lead again. He could tell that Xueqi was not in a good mood. The short and fat person braced himself and said, "Yes, second young master has found them. However, there are people protecting them. I think they're from the Yanjiao tribe. This is strange. Why would the Yanjiao tribe come here?" Pfft. Xueqi spat out the fruit he had just bitten and tossed half of the crispy fruit away. He shouted, "Come up here and talk." The short and fat man was shocked, but he reacted quickly and climbed onto the beast's back. He looked clumsy, but his movements were agile. He leaped onto the beast's back and came before the curtain. He bowed and said, "We've just received news that the Yanjiao tribe took the Gongjia family members away. Second young master is now fighting for them. Third young master, do you think we should hurry over? If we're too slow, the Gongjia family members will be taken away." The short and fat man waited for Xueqi's reply. He thought it was strange and asked again, "Young master, I'm not going." A voice came from inside. "Yes, immediately. What?" The short and fat man thought he had heard wrongly. Didn't the third young master and the second young master fight fiercely? They had to fight for everything. After all, the lord of Luoya City, Su Luan, had said that only one person could inherit his things. Now, among Su Luan's living children, only the second young master, Su Lu, and the third young master, Xueqi, were left. In the past, everyone thought it would be the eldest young master, Su Ka, and the second young master, Su Lu, who would fight for the right to be the lord of Luoya City. However, after the desert incident, the lord of Luoya City was no longer called the lord of Luoya City. Even so, the current Luoya City was at least twice as big as before. As for the title of lord, it didn't matter much since they couldn't surpass Rock Hill City. The city was twice as big, with more resources and wealth. They could even be entrusted with important tasks by the Rock Hill City King. This was a huge temptation. Su Luan's decision still didn't change. He said that there would only be one heir, and almost all the resources and wealth. Therefore, at that time, many people thought it would be a fight between the eldest young master and the second young master. However, they didn't expect that the eldest young master would encounter an accident during a mission and be killed by people from the other side of the sea. Only the second and third young masters were left. At that time, many people still thought that since the eldest young master was gone, then the second young master would definitely inherit the throne. However, the third young master, Xueqi, rose to power. Now, the two young masters were almost evenly matched. Everything was fiercely fought. If it was in the past, after receiving a mission, once he heard that Su Lu would arrive first, Xueqi would definitely be anxious and urge him to hurry. However, this time it was different. "I said I'm not going, and I'm not going. Didn't you hear me?" After a pause, Xueqi said again, "Slow down. There's no need to rush." "Yes." The short and fat man wiped the sweat from his forehead, thinking that the third young master was really hard to please. Just now, he said he wouldn't go, and the next thing he said was to slow down. Would he regret it after a while? No matter what, the team had already slowed down according to Xueqi's request. The originally hurried team now looked like they were taking a stroll, lazy and leisurely. Why are they from the Yanjiao tribe? Xueqi was troubled. If the Yanjiao people came, then the leader was most likely Xiao Xian. To be honest, Xueqi was a little afraid of Xiao Xian. This was something he felt from the beginning in Luoya City. Later on, some things made him even more afraid of Xiao Xian. However, he wasn't willing to give up just like that. That was why he asked the team to slow down. It would be best if the Yanjiao people and Su Li's people were both injured when they arrived. That would save him a lot of trouble. Chapter 748. Under the scorching sun, two groups of people stood facing each other amidst the endless yellow sands. Su Lu glared at Xiao Xian with a murderous glint in his eyes. If possible, he wanted to personally chop Xiao Xian up and feed him to the slaves. However, Su Lu cherished his life. He knew that Xiao Xian was not easy to deal with. Although he hadn't seen it with his own eyes back then, he had heard of the situation in the Colosseum. Sulu didn't want to take the risk. If he died, the right to inherit Autumnfall would only go to that idiot Su Gu. However, with Su Li's current status, he didn't need to go personally. He was a slave master and had slaves under his command. Ever since the situation in the desert changed, he had also trained some of his better slaves. He only needed to leave the fighting to the slaves while he watched from the sidelines. Not to mention, Sulu tilted his head slightly to look at a person seated diagonally behind him. This person was dressed in the same way as the silent people outside the group. They were all dressed in grayish-white sackcloth. The only difference was that while the silent people had their heads wrapped in sackcloth, this person only had his head covered by a hood. Only the lower half of his pale face could be seen. When the light was dim, not even a hint of his expression could be seen. In the desert, most people's skin was tanned due to the sun. However, this person looked like he had not seen Yongguang for a long time. He even gave off a sickly pale feeling. There was more than one person like this in Rock Hill City. Some participated in the coastal war while others followed the slave masters. His third brother also had such a person beside him. These people were the ones who controlled the monsters on the outskirts. Although having such people around made him uncomfortable, on the other hand, they were also a protective force. With these people around, Sulu felt a lot more at ease. The slaves under his command were also slowly being depleted. Glancing at the people behind him, Sulu felt more confident. He had 100 slaves on his side and 100 monsters on his side. Looking at Yanjiao's side, he counted no more than 50. Comparing the beasts, his beasts were obviously bigger than Xiao Xian's. Moreover, the beetle did not seem to be very powerful. With this comparison, Su Li's confidence increased once again. Hence, Su Li's eyes flashed with viciousness. If it had been anyone else, he might have let them go after they handed over the Gongjia family members. After all, the battle was exhausting and he could not bear to part with his subordinates. Training these slaves was not easy. But Yanjiao people? He would not leave a single one of them alive. He could even bring the Yanjiao corpses back to claim his reward. Sulu pulled on a metal bell beside him. Immediately, a slave came over. 8 armored slaves unloaded the hut from the back of the giant beast and carried it steadily like a palanquin. They were afraid that their hands would accidentally shake and make the people inside angry. Looking at their practiced movements, they must have done it many times. "Be careful, it's coming," Xiao Xian warned. The hut that was removed from the giant beast's body was only to allow the giant beast to participate in the battle without affecting the people inside. Sula sat inside and was carried to the back of the group. The golden-armored people surrounded him while the silent people stood at the front and the outermost circle. Without any worries, the giant golden beast's pants-like teeth moved and let out a howl like a gust of wind. It lifted its upper body and bent its dozens of legs downwards, exposing its abdomen that was almost touching the ground. Although its abdomen was not as heavily armored as its sides and back, it was still hard armor, albeit lighter in color. Then, the golden-armored beast smashed its upper body into the ground like a spiked club. The sandy ground shook violently as if a boulder had fallen or a mountain had collapsed. It was as if a sudden clap of thunder rang in their ears. Those who were close by felt their heads hurt and their chests churn. The 6 Gongjia members felt a sense of oppression. When they were escaping, they had never encountered a giant beast like this. Even if they had only seen it from afar. If they had encountered a giant beast like this, they would have died long ago. After the rumble, waves of sand rose and spread towards the Yanjiao people. The wave spread to the feet of the Yanjiao people. Even those who stood 100 meters away felt their footing become unstable. It was as if they were standing on a small boat in the middle of a storm, swaying and swaying. The giant golden figure stirred up a gust of sand that rubbed against the giant golden beast's armor. It was as if sand was being polished against hard metal, producing a sharp sizzling sound. Gongjia Ren lifted his sleeves to cover his nose and mouth, squinting his eyes into thin slits to prevent the sand from entering his eyes. His slightly wide sleeves flapped under the wind and sand, and his hair was almost blown parallel to the ground. This giant beast was not easy to deal with. Then, what should the Yanjiao people do? Gongjia Ren looked around. To Gongjia Ren's surprise, the Yanjiao people did not show any signs of fear or nervousness. It was as if the giant golden beast's performance was nothing more than a normal gust of wind. In reality, that was indeed the case. They were not pretending to be calm. The Yanjiao people really did not think much of the giant golden beast. What's with the pretense? We've even seen the king stoneworm. This giant beast may give Gongjia Ran and the rest a lot of pressure. However, to the Yanjiao people who were used to giant beasts, hunting fearsome beasts, and even a few king beasts, they were not affected much. The Yanjiao people only turned to glance at the giant golden beast, then turned their attention back to the masked and silent people. They were more concerned about these so-called monsters. However, the Yanjiao people's silence made Sulu think they were afraid. That's all you have. Forget it. Hand over Gongjia Ran and the rest and I'll give you time to leave, said Sulu slowly, as if this was a rare gift. He gave them time to leave but did not say how much time they would be given, nor did he mention how he would hunt them down. At this, Xiao Xian smiled and looked in the direction of the wind. You think you have an advantage in numbers? You want to bully us with numbers? So what if I do? Sulu thought it was normal to bully others with numbers. It was also the safest and he liked it the most. It would be abnormal if it was the other way around. Nothing. Xiao Xian raised his right forefoot and stomped down. The ground beneath his feet trembled slightly. It was not as strong as the giant golden beast but it traveled far. The air around them seemed to change slightly with this stomp, as if muffled thunder was coming from under Xiao Xian's feet. The sound was not loud, as if it came from afar, but also from underground. A layer of sand on the ground spread outwards in a circle, expanding rapidly. Soon it had passed by Su Li's side. The armored men standing around Su Lu felt a gentle gust of wind graze their feet. However, they had the illusion that a cold hand had gripped their feet, sending chills down their spines. The weather was hot and they had been traveling for a long time, so it should have been very hot. However, they couldn't help but shiver with an ominous premonition. Young master, something's wrong. Sula found it strange too. He pulled the cloth aside and looked outside. Suddenly, he shuddered. Beetles! He saw small black beetles appearing on the sand. One by one, they looked like they could be stomped to death. However, more and more beetles appeared. This gave him an ominous feeling. He then looked at the giant blue beetle beside Xiao Xian. Sula took a deep breath. His fingers trembled and he released the cloth. He swallowed his saliva. His voice was filled with suppressed shock. Insect tide. When did the horrors of the insect tide become known to everyone? When did it spread? In Su Li's memories, even though there were cases of beetles chewing on the corpses of battle beasts in the early days, that wasn't the start of their panic. The true terror that the insect swarm brought upon them started from an incident in the past. Back then, the Snowfield King sent 200 golden armored guards to hunt down Xiao Xian. However, not a single one of them returned. It was said that those who went out to search for the golden armored guards found the skeletons of the golden armored guards somewhere in the desert. All that was left were pale white bones, tattered clothes, and the golden armor that they were so proud of. They were half buried in the sand, filled with the aura of death. Even if one didn't see it with their own eyes, they could imagine such a strange scene just by hearing it from others. Although the rumor was exaggerated, the 200 golden armored guards might not have all died under the insect tide. However, the complete disappearance of the 200 golden armored guards was most likely related to the insect tide. It was also from then on that the insect tide became another disaster in the desert that caused everyone's expression to change. The slaves under Su Li's command were indeed armed according to the famous golden armor guards of Snowfield City. He and Sugu had done the same thing. The armors on these slaves were also made in the same batch, and Su Luan had distributed them later. It was a fair distribution of resources before the Lord of Luoya City chose his successor. Back then, the golden armored guards of Snowfield City, who were as cruel and bloody as a meat grinder, couldn't escape the insect tide. What would happen to his slaves? Su Lu was indeed proud of having a team of slaves armed with golden armor. However, he also knew that there was still a gap between his slaves and the golden armored guards of Snowfield City. As he thought about it, Su Lu felt a chill run down his spine. His teeth chattered. So this was what Xiao Xian meant when he said, bully with numbers. The black insects that rushed out from under the sand had formed a tide of insects. As far as the eye could see, the black tide of insects almost blocked most of the view. The black beetles swarmed towards Sulu like a tidal wave. The armored slaves screamed and slapped away the beetles that pounced on them. However, more and more beetles squeezed through the gaps between their armor and their clothes. The beasts that the slaves rode stomped their hooves in horror, flinging the people off their backs. The originally neat formation became a mess. However, there were exceptions. Xiao Xian looked at the situation with a solemn expression. They're avoiding the monsters. Those beetles, whether it was fresh or rotten meat, would not leave anything behind. However, when faced with the monsters, it was as if they didn't want to get close to them. They were very repulsive and even took a detour when they rushed past them. Compared to the panicked golden armored slaves, the people who were covered in linen standing on the periphery were like wooden blocks. They didn't react to their surroundings at all. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.